Chapter 563. Hearing what I said, the fatty rolled his eyes and flipped his t-shirt over, revealing his fat belly. I'm afraid that Officer Wang won't be surprised. He'll only think that there's something wrong with the two of us. After saying that, he sat on the ground and didn't want to leave. He continued to mutter, "Why is it so hot? I don't care. I want to rest." Just as he sat down, he seemed to feel uncomfortable. He turned his head and saw a rock that was as tall as a person. He jumped up and sat on the rock, fanning himself. "You're at the glorious consciousness realm, but you're so tired from climbing the mountain. Don't you feel ashamed?" I looked at the fatty, not knowing whether to laugh or cry. "Can't you use your Tao energy to dissipate the heat? You should try to use your Tao energy." The fatty rolled his eyes at me and said, "Ever since I came up the mountain, I felt that the Tao energy in my body was changing very slowly. It's obvious that there's some kind of restriction, but it's not to the extent that I can't use a trace of Tao energy. However, they've already set up a restriction. It's not good to go against them, right?" I was stunned. Then, I activated the Tao energy in my body. Just as the fatty said, I felt a trace of resistance when I activated the Tao energy. However, with my heavenly master cultivation, the resistance was so small that it could be ignored. That's why I didn't notice it. The place where Wanwu Grotto Heaven was located should be the place with the most abundant spiritual energy in Wanwu Mountain. Not to mention anything else, there should be a true dragon's vein inside. Otherwise, the cultivation of the people inside would be a big problem. Since there was a true dragon's vein, it wouldn't be a problem to use the power of the true dragon's vein to set up a restriction that hindered the movement of Tao energy. Moreover, the restriction wasn't as simple as suppressing Tao energy. Once Tao energy was used to resist the restriction, it would definitely cause a fluctuation. Thus, the restriction also had a warning function. Just as we were talking about the restriction, a young Taoist suddenly appeared next to us. He stared at the fatty with his round eyes and looked dissatisfied. "Stand up. Who allowed you to sit there?" The fatty and I were bewildered. We lifted our heads to look. The little Taoist was around 11 or 12 years old. He had delicate features, red lips, and white teeth. He wore a cyan Taoist robe, but he didn't look like an immortal. We only felt that he was exceptionally cute. Facing such a cute little Taoist, although he was scolded, Fatty did not feel embarrassed. Instead, he teased him and asked, "Oh? Then tell me, why can't I sit here? This is the spirit stone passed down by the ancestors of our Taoist temple. How can we allow you to tarnish it like this?" The little Taoist stretched out his hand and pointed at the rock below Fatty's buttocks. He had an indignant look on his face, as if Fatty had done something that deserved to be struck by lightning. I was bewildered and bent down to look. Sure enough, there was a small sign next to the stone. The sign looked old, and there were 4 traditional Chinese characters on it. No climbing. At this time, Fatty also saw the small wooden sign and immediately became unhappy. He shouted, "Aren't you trying to blackmail me? Who can see such a small sign?" Hearing that he was slandered as blackmail, the little Taoist was also unhappy. He pouted and said with grievance, "Normally, no one comes here. Even if someone comes, there are so many rocks beside us. Who would purposely climb up to such a high rock to sit?" He wasn't speaking nonsense. This was a rock that was as tall as a person. Even if a normal person wanted to sit on it, they might not be able to do so. Fatty was just arguing with me and purposely sat on it. Fatty was a bit embarrassed by what the little Taoist said. However, this fellow still had a child's heart, so he decided to act shamelessly. He sat on the edge of the rock and kicked his legs. He said with a smile, "Look, the wooden sign says that climbing is forbidden, but I didn't climb it. I sat on it, so it doesn't count as breaking the rule. Don't you think so?" This caused the little Taoist's morale to drop. He had probably never seen such a shameless person like Fatty. His chubby little finger pointed at Fatty. His small face was red, and he couldn't say anything for a long time. Looking at the two of them playing around, I didn't pay much attention to them. I turned around and looked around. I realized that the fatty and I had walked to a secluded place. There was a dense forest all around us. We were walking on a small path, surrounded by mountains and forests. There were no longer any crowds like the tourist attractions we had seen before. Just a few hundred meters in front of us, there was a shabby little Taoist temple. This temple was very different from the tourist attractions from before. It looked like it hadn't been repaired for a long time. I didn't know how many tiles were missing from the roof. I really suspected that when it rained, it would rain heavily outside and drizzle inside. In an isolated place, there was a shabby little Taoist temple, and this little Taoist. Interesting, I pondered for a while and thoughtfully looked at the angry little Taoist. I also felt like teasing him. I opened my mouth and asked, "Is that your Taoist temple in front of us? Why does it look so shabby? It can't be compared to the ones we saw before." The little Taoist was holding back his anger, but he didn't notice it. Hearing what I said, he immediately got angry again. He looked at me angrily and retorted loudly, "What do you know? We are the orthodox ones. Those shabby temples outside are just scamming you tourists for money." "Then why is your orthodox one so shabby? The ones outside that you said are all lies. They are grand and majestic, but who knows how many times better than yours." The little Taoist was obviously hit on his sore spot. He jumped and said, "What do you know? We are the orthodox." "Who said that you are orthodox?" I continued to smile as I asked unhurriedly. "My master said it." Talking about his master, the little Taoist puffed out his chest and looked like he was in the right. "Does your master's words count?" "Of course my master's words count. But isn't your master also in this temple?" I sighed. "Isn't this just selling melons and boasting?" The little Taoist was stunned. He clearly didn't think that I would say that. He stood there blankly and opened his mouth. He didn't know how to retort. "It seems like your Taoist temple is the one that's deceiving people." I sighed and intentionally shook my head. I said with a regretful expression, "That's true. It's so shabby. Who would believe that they are the orthodox ones? How could a temple that has truly inherited the orthodox ones not have money to decorate themselves?" You're talking nonsense." The little Taoist saw that I had already come to a conclusion and became even more angry. He pointed at me with tears almost coming out. "Did I say something wrong?" I spread my hands and put on an innocent expression. "If you were really a legitimate successor, would you not have enough money to buy yourself a new set of clothes?" Then I intentionally pointed at the patch on the little Taoist's Taoist robe. The little Taoist's face flushed red. It seemed like I touched his sore spot. He pouted and couldn't say anything. Okay, fatty, let's go." I sighed and waved my hand. I said to the fatty, "Let's go to another Taoist temple to offer incense. I'm afraid it's useless to offer incense in this deceiving temple. You can't leave." Hearing that we were going to leave, the little Taoist immediately panicked. He walked forward and grabbed my sleeve. I turned my head and purposely frowned. "Why won't you let us leave? Are you really going to scam us?" "It's not scam us. You are really sitting on the spirit stone passed down by my master." Although he was a bit dizzy from what I said, the little Taoist was stubborn. At this time, the fatty had already jumped down from the rock. I chuckled and looked at the little Taoist. I pointed at the fatty. "Look, he's already standing up. If you still don't let us leave, he's going to sit back down." You. The little Taoist was so angry that he didn't know what to say. However, he didn't let go of my sleeve. After a while, he said, "I don't care. You have to come with me to the temple. I'll report this to master." I looked at him strangely. "If it's really our fault, we should be running now. Why do we have to go with you to the temple? Do you think we're stupid?" The little Taoist was stunned. He seemed to think that what I said made sense. However, he still didn't want to give up. After thinking for a while, he made a fierce expression and said to me, "You can't run. If you chase us away, I'll use the Taoist spell that my master taught me to beat you up." After saying that, he suddenly covered his mouth. "That's not right. My master doesn't allow me to use Taoist spells." The little Taoist seemed to be unwilling to give up. He hesitated for a while before glaring at me. "Even if I secretly use it, master won't know. Hurry and come with me." The fat man looked at him and laughed. I smiled and nodded. "All right. If you don't use Taoist spells to beat us up, we'll go with you." The little Taoist let go of my sleeve and led the way. From time to time, he would look back as if he was afraid that we would run away. The fat man followed behind me. He frowned and whispered to me, "Third baby, we should go to Wanwu Grotto Heaven to find Officer Wang. Why are you playing with this little Taoist?" "Don't worry." I smiled and shook my head. "Did you notice anything strange about this little Taoist?" "A strange place." The fat man frowned and mumbled, "Isn't he just a kid at the dragon-seeking realm?" As soon as he said that, he realized something was wrong. The fat man looked enlightened. "This kid is also a cultivator." I nodded. "This kid is around 11 or 12 years old. Don't you think it's strange that his cultivation base is close to sealing acupoints at such a young age? If that's the case, why is his sect in this kind of place?" The fat man finally put on a serious face and muttered, "Is this shabby temple fake? It looks shabby from the outside, but it's a different world inside. I heard that many Taoist sects like to play like this. Let's go in and take a look." I smiled and followed the little Taoist into the shabby temple. As soon as we entered the temple, I felt an old, rotten smell. I lifted my head and saw that the inside of the temple was shabby. The wood looked like it had been eaten by insects. I wondered if it would collapse in the next second. Spider webs grew between the pillars. At first glance, it didn't look like anyone had cleaned it. The little Taoist saw us looking around and blushed. However, he didn't explain much and just said, "Let's go quickly. My master is inside." At this moment, I couldn't be bothered to bicker with him. Instead, I was quite curious about the master that he was talking about. This little Taoist was at the dragon-seeking realm, and had even reached the late stage close to perfection. Then, his master should be a sealing acupoint expert at the very least, or even glory of consciousness. The glory of consciousness realm was considered not bad among cultivators. Disregarding the high and mighty celestial masters, the glory of consciousness realm could be said to be the backbone of the entire cultivation world. Even in a place like Celestial Master Sect in Mount Longhu, a glory of consciousness realm cultivator was enough to be a hall master. Why was he willing to teach a little Taoist in this shabby temple? If this little Taoist was really talented, then he should be allowed to enter Wanwu Wonderland to cultivate in the dragon vein. If his talent wasn't enough, then he wouldn't need a glory of consciousness expert to accompany him. Thinking that, I became more and more curious about the master that this little Taoist was talking about. Very quickly, we entered the main hall. At the very center of the main hall was a clay statue. Under the dim light, it seemed quite mysterious. Below the statue, an old Taoist sat on a praying mat, his eyes closed in meditation. "Master!" When the little Taoist saw the old man, he immediately pounced over with a face full of grievance. He loudly complained, "Master, they took our spirit stones. I told them that we are the most orthodox in the mountain, but they didn't believe me." Chapter 564. The old Taoist furrowed his eyebrows and didn't say anything. The little Taoist, on the other hand, became smug. He probably felt that he had someone to rely on with his master beside him. He puffed out his chest and said to me smugly, "Hurry up and apologize, then I'll let you leave." The little Taoist was smug, but the old Taoist's expression grew uglier. Cultivators could sense the other's aura. I only had to lift my eyes to take a look. Without even using my power of insight, I could tell that this old Taoist was at the beginner stages of glorious consciousness. The old Taoist's realm was too far from mine, so he naturally couldn't see through my cultivation. I reckoned that his expression changed because of that. However, after a moment, the old Taoist's face that was as dry and rough as an old tree's bark squeezed out a smile. He didn't look at us, but extended his hand to rub the little Taoist's head and asked, "Imo, what happened?" They were sitting on the spirit stone just now. The little Taoist named Imo pouted and looked angrily at the fatty and me. I said that we are the orthodox sect of Wang Wu Mountain that has been passed down for 1,000 years. This is the spirit stone that our master left behind, but they didn't believe me. They said that they wanted to go to those deceptive places to offer incense. Fellow Taoists, my disciple is naughty, please excuse me. The old Taoist smiled wryly and cupped his hands towards the fatty and me. However, this small temple is simple and crude, so there's nothing to see. If the two of you want to offer incense and ask for the divination stick, it's better to go to the bigger temples in front. Hearing the old Taoist say that, Imo instantly pouted and said unwillingly, "Master, but they are slandering us, Imo." The old Taoist was slightly dissatisfied. He frowned and scolded softly. The little Taoist shrunk his neck and didn't dare to make another sound. "All right, please leave." The old Taoist clearly didn't want to have anything to do with us, so he ordered us to leave with an indifferent expression. I squinted my eyes. Although the old man in front of me only had the cultivation of the beginner stages of glorious consciousness, he gave me a very strange feeling. There seemed to be a huge power hidden in his body. It made me feel a little fearful. As for the mountain-suppressing spirit stone, they mentioned, I didn't believe it either. There was no spiritual power in it at all. Even if there was something special about it that I couldn't see, it wouldn't have been left at the door to be exposed to the element. I had thought that the little Taoist had been deceived by his master, and that the people in this broken temple had evil intentions, using an ordinary stone to blackmail others. But now, it seemed that there was something else going on. I chuckled. Just as I was about to speak, I suddenly felt a fluctuation of Tao Qi. I turned to look at the little Taoist, Imo. The little guy pursed his lips tightly. It was obvious that he was upset about not being able to clear the name of his Taoist temple. I saw his small hands hidden in his wide sleeves. His sleeves were slightly trembling, and the Taoist Qi fluctuations were coming from them. I couldn't help but find it funny. This little fellow really wanted to teach me and the fatty a lesson. Although the old Taoist was closer, his cultivation was lower, so he was slower to notice than me. When he turned his head, it was already too late. The little Taoist's face was solemn. His small hands, which still had some baby fat, suddenly swung out from his sleeve. A crystal-clear small sword appeared out of thin air. Seeing this small sword, I was stunned. Then, a wave of shock surged in my heart. This little Imo was actually a sword cultivator. Speaking of sword cultivators, I had only seen a few words in the death scripture. I knew that this was a group of cultivators unique to Huaxia. From Earth Master to Heaven Master, they only had one sword in their body. Even when they reached Yang God Celestial Master, they didn't have a humanoid Yang God like others. What replaced it was the same sword. Sword cultivators didn't rely on talismans or spells. No matter if it was cultivation or fighting, they only relied on a sword. Because it was secretive, it wasn't widely spread. After the Ming and Qing dynasties, it gradually became extinct. When a sword cultivator cultivated, they paid attention to nurturing the sword. At the beginning, their strength was weaker than other cultivators, and it was more difficult for them to grow. However, once they succeeded in nurturing the sword and became a celestial master, they would have a sword soul that was equivalent to the celestial master's seal. Only then would the power of a sword cultivator be completely released. It could be said that if they encountered a god, they would kill a god. If they encountered a Buddha, they would kill a Buddha. It was extremely fierce and terrifying. However, because sword cultivators needed to nurture the sword at the Earth Master stage, compared to other cultivators, they didn't need that much spiritual power before they reached the Celestial Master realm. That was why this little Taoist was hiding in a broken temple with ordinary spiritual energy to cultivate in Wangu heavenly abode. While I was thinking, the old Taoist's expression suddenly changed. "Imo, put away the sword soul," the old Taoist shouted. There was a faint sound of metal and stone in his aged voice. He suddenly leaped up, and the old Taoist robe on his body fluttered even though there was no wind. He leaped into the air like a rock spreading its wings, blocking between me and Imo. Seeing that his master had such a strong reaction, the little Taoist shivered in fear. The small sword that was originally in the sky also shook and fell down like a headless fly. "Master, I just wanted to prove that we aren't swindlers." Imo probably felt that something was wrong. With a sobbing tone, he carefully put away the transparent sword soul into his body and explained to the old Taoist in a low voice. "I said before, don't use this sword technique in front of outsiders. Why didn't you listen?" The old Taoist sighed. Then, he glared at me and the fatty and said coldly, "Two Taoists, this old man advised you to leave with good intentions. If you don't leave, then don't leave now." I smiled faintly. "Sire should also be a sword cultivator, right? A sword cultivator's strength isn't bad. However, Sire is too arrogant if you want to make me stay." As expected, you recognized me. The old Taoist's gaze became even colder. His face even carried a hint of determination to die. This old man has concealed his identity in this abandoned village for over 10 years. I didn't think that I would still be found. Before he finished his sentence, an enormous aura rose from the old Taoist's body. It seemed that he was accumulating power in preparation for a fatal blow. "I know that you are a strong person in the later stages of glory of memory, or even in the complete stages of glory of memory," the old Taoist said slowly. The white beard by the side of his mouth trembled. "But so what? There are many souls in the later stages of glory of memory under this old man's sword." Following his words, the aura around the old Taoist grew stronger. "Master." Little Imo seemed to be scared silly. He looked at his master and then at us. His eyes instantly turned red, and a few drops of tears hung at the corner of his eyes. "Master, let them go. It's all Imo's fault. Imo doesn't dare to use his sword technique in front of others anymore. They already know your identity as a sword cultivator. I must kill them." The old Taoist roared again. Imo shivered in fear. After all, he was just a child. He was naive. Looking at his master, who was usually gentle and gentle, suddenly become so strict and terrifying, little Imo shrunk his body. He used a mosquito-like voice to say, "Master, they didn't bully Imo. Don't kill them, okay? This little fellow was a kind and good child. His Taoist heart was pure. No wonder he had such a high cultivation at such a young age. Little fellow, don't worry. This old man can't kill us." The fat man who had been standing at the side also recognized the old Taoist's cultivation. He wasn't nervous at all. He smiled at the little Taoist with a sly face. "Little fellow, why don't we make a bet? We won't kill this old man later. As long as we defeat him, you will follow us and change your master, okay?" "Impudent." The old Taoist's expression was as cold as ice. Hearing the fat man's words, he was even more certain that we didn't have good intentions. "You really came for Imo. Even if I have to risk my life today, I won't let you succeed." With that, he shook his Taoist robe. Little Imo was carried to the back by a gentle Taoist chi. At the same time, the old Taoist opened his mouth and spat out a small cyan sword. The small sword grew bigger and bigger until it was the same size as a normal weapon. At the same time, the old Taoist's face turned pale, as though he had used up a lot of energy. After summoning the Taoist's sword in his body, he reached out with one hand and quickly used his thumb to cut the tip of his index finger. A drop of blood flew out and landed on the blade of the small cyan sword. I, a sword cultivator, only have one sword in this life. No matter gods or demons, I will slay them with one sword. The old Taoist laughed bitterly. His body gave off a loud bang. It was obvious that he had used a move that would put his life on the line. Kill! The old Taoist spat out another mouthful of blood. The cyan sword trembled slightly, and its entire body turned a strange green and red color. Then, like a bolt of lightning, it dashed toward the fatty and me. Following the green and red light, the old Taoist's thunderous roar spread over. Although I am not a heavenly master and have yet to nurture the sword, I have never shown this Taoist sword to anyone in these 10 years. Today, I will use you two traitors to sacrifice to the sword. Die. In an instant, the green and red sword light was about to reach my body. Although a sword cultivator wasn't ordinary, the old Taoist was only at the beginner stage of glorious memory. Even if I had nurtured the Taoist sword in my body for 10 years, it was just a normal attack to me. Just as I was about to grab the Taoist sword, the old Taoist's face suddenly turned pale. He shouted, "Explode!" The moment he said that, the sword stopped in the air and gave off a blinding light. Then, countless sword shadows wrapped around me. The moment the old Taoist attacked, he chose to fight to the death. He would rather give up the Taoist sword that he had nurtured for many years and kill my fat man with a thunderous strike. In an instant, the enormous Taoist energy that had gathered in the sword exploded. The entire small temple was covered in white light. Unfortunately, the difference in realm was too huge. It was inconvenient for me to move my hands. With just a thought, the seal in my body gathered above my head. When the white light dissipated, the old Taoist coughed as he struggled to support his body. He lifted his head and stared at the fat man and me. He seemed to be extremely confident in his Taoist sword. His furrowed brows loosened and the nervousness from before dissipated. However, when the white light dissipated and the fat man and I appeared unharmed, the old Taoist's eyes opened wide. At this moment I felt helpless. The reason why I came to this small temple was because I was interested in the little Taoist Ah Mo's cultivation. Who knew that after the old Taoist saw me, he would treat the fat man and me as his mortal enemies. I had planned to subdue him and then explain to him. Who knew that the moment he attacked, he would use such a desperate move. He didn't give me any time to explain at all. At this moment I was angry. I didn't retract the Heavenly Master seal but left it 3 inches above my head. It slowly spun and a white light covered the bottom of the seal, not revealing the words on it. Heavenly Master. Chapter 565. After one strike, the old Taoist had obviously tested my strength. His eyes were filled with despair as he stared at me and muttered to himself, "It's a Heavenly Master. It shouldn't be. Even if it's a Heavenly Master, he shouldn't be able to block my destruction sword." That old Taoist's desperate strike would have severely injured an ordinary Heavenly Master, even if he didn't die. That was the horror of a sword cultivator. However, he had met me. My cultivation base was several times that of an ordinary Heavenly Master. I cultivated both Taoism and witchcraft, and the true qi in my body was more than twice that of an ordinary Heavenly Master. Although I was still in the early stage of Seal Heavenly Master, in terms of power, I was confident that I could fight anyone below Yang Spirit. At least, my cultivation base was equivalent to the late stage of Seal Heavenly Master. Although a sword cultivator was scary, he was unlucky to have met me. Looking at the old Taoist's dispirited and desperate face, the anger in my heart dissipated. I thought about it and put away the seal, wanting to explain to him. Before I could speak, Imo jumped up from the ground and ran to the old Taoist lying on the ground, crying, Master, master, what's wrong? Imo and the old Taoist obviously had a deep relationship. Tears streamed down his face as he hugged the old Taoist who had fallen on the ground, his face filled with worry. The old Taoist smiled sadly when he saw Imo. His eyes were filled with love. He reached out to rub Imo's head, and his face suddenly became solemn. He said to Imo in a low voice, "Hurry up and go out from the back door to find your Uncle Wang. I can't protect you anymore. I've already sent a message to inform your Uncle Wang. Hurry up and go. You'll be safe once you see Uncle Wang." Then, he pushed Imo behind him and struggled to stand up. He glared at me fiercely. It was obvious that he was prepared to block the fat man and me with his life, so that Imo could escape successfully. I was confused by his parting. Originally, it was just a coincidence that I met Imo, and coming to this small temple was an unintentional move. Who knew that as soon as the old Taoist saw me, he wanted to die together with me? At this moment, he was certain that I had ill intentions. I didn't know how to explain myself. Seeing that the old Taoist was going to attack again, I suppressed my unhappiness and shouted coldly, "Wait! I'm just passing by. Taoist friend, is there any misunderstanding?" Misunderstanding? The old Taoist didn't listen to my explanation. He smiled miserably. Since he was gathering his power, blood trickled down from the corner of his mouth. "It's a misunderstanding. You even said you wanted to change your master. Don't think that I don't know your tricks. I protected this child for an entire 10 years so that he wouldn't be captured by you heartless fellows to be a sword slave like his parents. I never expected that he would still be found by you in the end." Sword slave? I was puzzled. I knew about sword cultivators, but what was a sword servant? It was obvious that he and little Imo had some sort of enmity. He was hiding in this rundown temple to avoid his enemies. Today, the fatty and I had unexpectedly appeared, so he thought that we were his enemies and had come to seek revenge. That was why he was acting so fiercely. With that thought, I felt relieved. This old Taoist was a pitiful man. I guessed his fear of his enemies had made him sensitive. That was why this series of misunderstandings had occurred. To prevent the misunderstanding from deepening, I hastily shook my head and solemnly told him, "Taoist friend has indeed misunderstood. I didn't come here to look for Imo, nor will I capture him." "Stop pretending." The old Taoist coldly looked at me. He didn't believe me at all. He coughed violently, and blood trickled down from the corner of his mouth. He sneered and said, "The people of your Schwanda Wonderland have always been hypocritical. Even at this time, you still say that you won't capture him. If you really won't capture him, why did you come to my small temple? Don't tell me that it was an accident. I purposely built this small temple in the depths of Mount Wangwu to isolate it from human habitation. Mount Wangwu is 150 kilometers away from here. Why didn't you go anywhere else but here? Do you really think that I'm a fool?" In his anger, the old Taoist seemed to have lost his mind. His eyes turned red as he glared at me. Schwanda Wonderland. It must be one of the blessed lands. The old Taoist's cultivation base wasn't high, but his enemy was a Wonderland family. It was no wonder that he was so nervous. Although I was angry at him, I could only shake my head and smile bitterly. I took out a pill and threw it to him. I said, "This is a healing pill. It contains my Tao Qi and true essence. After you swallow it, the injuries in your body will recover." After giving him the pill, I wanted to say goodbye, but the old Taoist interrupted me. He threw the pill to the side and sneered, "It's this trick again." That year, Imo's parents were fed with mind-controlling drugs. Because they didn't want to be enslaved, they committed suicide. Do you think that I will fall for the same trick again? I was stunned. Little Imo, who was still standing behind the old Taoist and didn't want to leave, shivered. He pulled the old Taoist's sleeve with a pale face and asked shakily, "Master, didn't you say that my parents died in a car accident not long after I was born?" The old Taoist smiled wryly. He supported his body and hugged little Amo. His eyes were red. I didn't dare to tell you the truth. But you have to remember that your parents died in the hands of these people. You have to train hard in the future. After you've condensed your sword spirit, you can take revenge for your parents and master. Do you remember? Hearing that, the sadness on the little Taoist's face lessened. His anger rose. He suddenly wiped his tears and broke free from the old Taoist's embrace. He didn't run away, but gritted his teeth and took out his small sword. Then, he charged at me and the fatty. I'm going to kill you. After the old Taoist destroyed his own Tao sword, he was already weak. At this moment, when Imo broke free from his grasp, it was too late for him to pull Imo back. He could only cry out, Imo, don't! At that moment, Imo was completely immersed in his hatred. Although he was only at the dragon-seeking realm, after he took out his sword, there was an imposing aura that charged at me. What was going on? I sighed and gently raised my hand. A gentle Tao Chi and true essence appeared and blocked in front of Imo. It was as if the little Taoist had crashed into an invisible wall. He rushed forward with tears streaming down his face, but he couldn't move an inch forward. Because of his hatred, this old Taoist had become obsessed. Coincidentally, he had already determined that I was his enemy. No matter how I explained, he wouldn't believe me. Helpless, I didn't bother to explain anymore. The only thing I could do now was to leave. When the old Taoist woke up, he would naturally understand. I looked at the old Taoist and prepared to say goodbye again. However, at that moment, the old Taoist's eyes suddenly lit up. He suddenly had hope and looked behind me. I was stunned and immediately turned to look. It was Wang Can rushing over from afar. Ah Fu and the others followed behind him. It was obvious that he had seen the situation here and was dumbfounded. Brother Wang. The old Taoist acted as if he had grasped a life-saving straw. He screamed crazily at Wang Can in the distance. Brother Wang, they're here to catch Imo. Come and save Imo. As he screamed crazily, Wang Can finally arrived. However, after glancing at the old Taoist, he respectfully walked to me and cupped his fists to greet me. Sage. Seeing Wang Can's behavior, the old Taoist was like a duck that had its neck pinched. His voice stopped abruptly. He looked at Wang Can and then at me. His face was bewildered and desperate. It seemed he had regarded Wang Can as his enemy. The old Taoist seemed to have lost his mind. I nodded at Wang Can to return his greeting. Then, I pointed at the old Taoist and said, "There's a misunderstanding. This old Taoist mistook me for someone from the Schwanda Wonderland. You should explain it to him." Schwanda Wonderland? Wang Can frowned, his face unhappy. He turned to look at the old Taoist, and his voice became cold. Huang Zhu, he's a guest I invited to the Wanwu Wonderland to attend the ceremony. He has a noble status, and he's not from the Schwanda Wonderland. Don't try to fool him. At this time, the old Taoist could no longer listen to others. He sneered and even looked at Wang Can with a cold look in his eyes. Imo was kneeling next to the old Taoist. His face was sad and angry. He looked at us and then at the old Taoist. He didn't know what to do. I didn't know what to do, so I simply waved my hand and said to Wang Can, "You find someone to deal with this. We'll talk somewhere else." Wang Can turned around and talked to the people behind him. Then, he called the fatty and I to leave the ruined temple. We went to the big rock where the fatty had sat earlier. I looked at the lush forest and pointed at the ruined temple. I asked Wang Can, "All right, tell me, what's going on with these two Taoist priests?" "Sage, it's my fault. I've made a fool of myself." Wang Can forced a smile and said, "This old Taoist was a friend of my father's. He has been here for more than 10 years, but he didn't want to come to the Wanwu Wonderland. He only asked the Wang family to protect him and his disciple. He built a ruined temple in this remote mountain and lived in seclusion every day. Today, I received a message from him. He told me that his enemy had come to take revenge. That's why I came here. I didn't expect that it would be you. I nodded. Tell me more about their identities. Also, tell me about their relationship with the Schwanda Wonderland. That old Taoist came to me more than 10 years ago. Wang Can hesitated for a moment, then said, Sage, you know about sword cultivators, right? I nodded, so Wang Can continued. These two people are sword cultivators, especially the young Taoist priest named Amo. He has the best talent among sword cultivators. He's called the innate sword embryo. Innate sword embryo? I raised my eyebrows. I had never heard of such a thing before, so I couldn't help but be curious. Wang Can continued to explain. The so-called innate sword embryo is the constitution most suitable for sword cultivators. They can condense the sword's soul at the beginning of their cultivation, and their cultivation speed is amazing. As long as there are no accidents along the way, they can condense the real spirit of sword principle within 60 years. The real spirit of sword principle is equivalent to our yang spirit. Yang spirit. I was shocked. Cultivation was like a reverse journey, especially after the celestial master realm. It was extremely difficult to make any further progress. Take me for example. After I became a celestial master, I still practiced diligently every day, but the progress of my realm was extremely slow. I didn't know when I would condense the yang spirit. It was because of my excellent talent and all kinds of fortuitous encounters. If it were other cultivators at my age, I'm afraid they wouldn't even dare to think about being a celestial master. However, this young Taoist priest, Amo, would definitely become a celestial master in 60 years. His talent was really terrifying. An ordinary man's wealth would become his own ruin. With this kind of talent, it was normal for conflicts to arise. It was just like when I had revealed my talent of 4 meridians at the Young Phoenix gathering. That was why I had caused so many conflicts. I sighed and thought for a moment. Then I asked Wang Can, what's that sword slave? Chapter 566. There were many strange things in the metaphysics world. Although I had been cultivating for many years, there were few things that could shake my mind. However, after listening to Wang Can's explanation of the sword slaves, my heart was still shaken, and I felt a chill run down my spine. That was a living person, a living cultivator. According to Wang Can, the sword slaves were like corpse puppets that had been refined into magical weapons to enhance their power. Although I had the cultivation base of a heavenly master, I didn't dare to treat ordinary people like ants, let alone cultivators. However, the Schwanda Wonderland had refined cultivators into slaves that had lost their intellect, and they didn't have any respect for life. Now that I thought about it, it wasn't just the Schwanda Wonderland. In Wangu Wonderland there were also slaves like Afu, Alu, and Ajin. It was just that those slaves had retained their intellect. In terms of foundation, there was not much difference between the two. One was gentle, while the other was bloodthirsty. Perhaps the so-called blessed paradises and metaphysics families that had existed for thousands of years had relied on this cruel rule to survive for thousands of years and have an extraordinary status. Their power and their foundation were built on the flesh and blood of these so-called slaves. Only the fittest survived, and the world was a Shuraba. Under the law of the jungle, if you wanted to rise, you had to step on the heads of others. In principle, what the blessed paradises did was understandable. However, humans were humans, and they had to be different from animals that ate raw meat and drank blood. The Wanwu Wonderland's practice of providing slaves to protect their families was acceptable. However, the Schwanda Wonderland's practice of raising sword slaves had crossed the line. I sighed and thought for a while. Then I asked Wang Can, so, the Schwanda Wonderland is good at making sword slaves? Yes. Like our Wanwu Wonderland, the Schwanda Wonderland doesn't have many talented people. The only thing they can rely on are the two young god sword slaves who have condensed the true spirit of the sword path. Wang Can hesitated for a while, then sighed and said, "The two sword slaves are Ah Mo's parents." I frowned. The Taoist priest had said that Ah Mo's parents didn't want to be enslaved, so they committed suicide. How could they still be alive? Wang Can told me that Ah Mo's parents had committed suicide. However, the Xuanda fairyland had been raising sword slaves for thousands of years. Their methods were very magical, and sword slaves didn't need intelligence. That was why they had preserved Ah Mo's parents' vitality and successfully turned them into sword slaves. The old Taoist didn't know about this, but Wang Can, as the current master of the Wangu fairyland, knew about it. "It's crazy," I sighed, feeling depressed. At this moment, I understood why the old Taoist had acted so crazily. It wasn't because of hatred, but because of fear. That year when Ah Mo's parents were captured, he brought little Ah Mo to escape to Wangu Grotto Heaven. Although I don't know the details, I can imagine that it must have been a tragic matter of life and death. Even though he had been on the brink of death for many years, the old Taoist's heartstrings were still stretched taut. When he suddenly met me, the fear in his heart burst out. That was why there were so many misunderstandings. Thinking about this, the resentment I had for the old Taoist dissipated. After a moment of silence, I suddenly thought of a possibility. When I turned to look at Wang Can, my face was as dark as water. I asked him sternly, "Wang Can, tell me, do you have the intention to turn Ah Mo into a sword slave?" As a fairyland family, the Wanwu fairyland wasn't having a good time. I didn't believe that Wang Can wouldn't be tempted by a young god sword slave whose fighting power was higher than that of the young god's celestial master. After listening to my question, Wang Can was stunned for a moment. Then, he replied solemnly, "Absolutely not. Although the Wanwu fairyland has declined, we don't dare to forget the teachings of our ancestors. If you want to cultivate the Tao, you must first cultivate the human nature. Only by being an upright person can you be qualified to cultivate the Tao. This is the foundation of the Wanwu fairyland. Otherwise, when Taoist Huang Zhu took Ah Mo to escape, he wouldn't have chosen to seek refuge in the Wanwu fairyland. Moreover, the sword slave technique is a secret of the Xuanda fairyland. Even if I wanted to, I didn't have the means." After listening to his explanation, I heaved a sigh of relief. The Wanwu fairyland had a deep relationship with me. Whether it was because of my identity or because of our previous friendship, we were inseparable. If the Wanwu fairyland was a cruel family like the Xuanda fairyland, I really didn't know how to deal with it. After talking for a long time, the fat man couldn't help but interrupt and ask Wang Can, "What about that old man? He's also a sword cultivator, right?" I saw that his cultivation was only at the early stage of the glorious consciousness realm, but the sword he threw out made even me tremble with fear. If it weren't for Zhou Yi, I'm afraid I wouldn't have been able to resist that sword. Hearing the fat man's words, Wang Can frowned and said coldly, "You and I are both from the 9 cauldron families, and we all respect the sage as our master. How dare you call the sage by his name?" The fatty and I were stunned by his sudden rage. Back in Chio's tomb, Wang Can and the fat man had a dispute because of the way they addressed each other. I stopped them, but now they quarreled again. I was a little embarrassed. I reached out and held down the fat man, who also looked unhappy, and explained to Wang Can, "I have a different relationship with him. We grew up together. My name is just a title. Don't worry too much about it. Let's talk about the question he asked." After persuading him, Wang Can let go of the question for the time being. He glanced at the fat man coldly and continued, "In terms of combat power, sword cultivators are stronger than other cultivators. The old Taoist was a good friend of Ah Mo's parents, and he already had the cultivation of the glorious consciousness realm. When he fled with Ah Mo, he was seriously injured, and his realm fell to the early stage of the glorious consciousness realm. Now, although his cultivation has not recovered, His combat power is still far beyond the ordinary early stage of the glorious consciousness realm. It's normal that he can use that sword. It's a pity that his Taoist foundation is damaged, and he can't recover or go further. Otherwise, if he becomes a celestial master and uses a Taoist sword, I'm afraid even the sage won't be able to deal with him. After saying that, Wang Can seemed to sigh with emotion. He said, "Cultivators of my generation pay attention to two things on the road of cultivation. One is talent and the other is resources. Both are indispensable. The old Taoist was seriously injured, and his talent was damaged. If he had enough cultivation resources, he could gradually recover over the years. It's a pity that he didn't trust the Wang family, so he didn't go to our Wanwu Grotto Heaven and use the resources there to heal his injuries. Otherwise, it wouldn't be difficult for him to recover his cultivation and even become a celestial master." His words reminded me of the time when the Lu family had destroyed my meridians, and I had used the saliva of the real dragon to dredge my meridians. The saliva of the real dragon was a cultivation resource. Wang Ken was right. However, when it came to the conditions of cultivation, his words were not comprehensive enough. I replied with a smile, "About cultivation, the common Taoists have a saying called Dharma, wealth, companion, and place. It's quite useful." Wang Can's ancestor was also a Taoist, but he had lived in the blessed enclave for a long time and had been separated from the common world. He didn't understand what I meant. The fat man next to me was also a Taoist, and he had been cultivating in the common world. Seeing that Wang Can was puzzled, he answered me proudly. "You don't know this. The so-called wealth, companion, dharma, and place refers to the four elements of cultivation. Wealth refers to the treasures of heaven and earth and cultivation resources. Companion refers to not only the dual cultivation partner, but also the fellow cultivators. They can help each other to speed up their cultivation and gain more benefit. Dharma refers to the cultivation method. Only when someone preaches to you can you enter the Taoist path. Lastly, place refers to the place for cultivation. For example, your Wanwu Grotto Heaven has found a good place for cultivation, so it can maintain the speed of cultivation of your clansmen." After listening to the fat man's explanation, Wang Can's eyes flashed. He seemed to understand something. He frowned and thought about something. All right, let's go to your Wanwu Grotto Heaven." After the fat man finished showing off, he seemed a little tired. He yawned and said impatiently, "Your blessed enclave doesn't dare to show up. Not only do you want to hide, but you also want to set up some kind of restriction formation. I had to climb the mountain for a whole day. Now that you're here, you should take us in." This guy was probably really tired. He was still chattering away at this time. Wang Can ignored him. His eyes were full of disdain. After glaring at the fat man, he turned to me and asked for my opinion. I gave a wry smile. I didn't know why the two of them had turned against each other. They didn't like each other, and they didn't treat each other well. I forced a smile and nodded. "Lead the way. I also want to see what the paradise looks like." Wang Can nodded and smiled. He pointed to the front and said to me respectfully, "Sage, this way, please." Before leaving, I turned to look at the dilapidated temple. The dilapidated temple stood alone in the lush forest. At this time, the sun was setting, and its afterglow shone on the bricks and tiles of the temple, reflecting a warm orange light. However, I couldn't feel any warmth in my heart. I didn't know if it was because of Ah Mo's miserable life, or if it was because of the cruel and gloomy metaphysics world, which had been torn off its bright and clean surface, which made me feel a little sad. Indistinctly, Ah Mo's cries could be heard from the small temple. That old Taoist had saved him from the evil people of Xuanda Grotto and brought him up. It had been more than 10 years since then. Thinking about it, to little Imo, this old Taoist was the closest and most respected person in the world. Now that the old Taoist was injured, he couldn't help but feel sad. I couldn't bear to look at him anymore. I turned around and was about to leave. Suddenly, I caught a glimpse of the boulder standing next to the dilapidated temple. Everything that had happened today was because of this boulder. I pointed at the boulder and asked Wang Can. I heard from Emo that this is a spirit stone. Do you know what's so mysterious about this boulder? This boulder? Wang Can looked puzzled when he heard my question. He answered, this boulder. I remember that year, the old Taoist came here and begged the Wangu Grotto Heaven to take Emo in. My father's heart softened and he agreed. He left Emo, who was still a baby at that time, with me and left on his own. More than a month later, he came back with this boulder covered in blood. At that time, I wondered how he had done it. As for its mysteriousness, I had never heard of it. Wang Can's words made me more puzzled. According to him, this boulder was very important. Otherwise, the old Taoist wouldn't have risked his life to bring it here. However, the old Taoist had only reached the peak of the glorious knowledge realm at that time. Since he had taken it back from the Schwanda Grotto Heaven, it couldn't be too precious. Moreover, everything had its owner. Even if this boulder was mysterious, it belonged to the old Taoist and Imo. It didn't have much to do with me. Chapter 567. From the time I fought with the Taoist priest to the time Officer Wang hurried over, it had been less than 15 minutes. That was why I thought that this place was very close to Wangu Grotto Heaven. Unexpectedly, after half an hour, Officer Wang still didn't stop. Among us, the fat man had the lowest cultivation base. Moreover, he was tired, so he couldn't help but ask Officer Wang, "How long will it take for us to get there?" Officer Wang pointed at the top of a mountain in front of us and said, "Climb that mountain, and we'll be there soon." The fat man and I looked up. The mountain wasn't far from us, but there were lush trees and no traces of buildings. It didn't look like a place where people lived. Moreover, that mountain was the same place where the fat man and I had come from. It seemed that we had passed that place, but we hadn't found any traces of human habitation. I guess the fat man was angry because of the way I had addressed him. He shouted, "We just passed that place. There's nothing there. Don't fool us." Officer Wang knew where Wangu Grotto Heaven was. The fat man's words sounded like he was trying to pick a fight with us. I glared at him and tried to smooth things over. "Fatty, you're right. We've searched everywhere, but we didn't find the place. I suppose there's a concealing formation at the entrance of your Wangu Grotto Heaven, right?" Officer Wang didn't even look at the fat man. When he turned to look at me, he wore a warm smile and said softly, "The sage is right. The entrance of Wangu Grotto Heaven is very mysterious. It's on this mountain, but it's not." "Kid, what kind of riddle are you talking about?" The fat man was a little annoyed. He squinted at Officer Wang and said in a harsh tone, "If it's not on this mountain, why did you lead us for so long? I'm so tired that I've lost a few pounds of fat." The fat man didn't want to give up. I glared at him and scolded, "Look at your fat body. It's a good thing that you've lost a few pounds. Don't talk. Listen to Officer Wang's introduction." I was close to the fat man, so he didn't get angry when I scolded him. He just shut his mouth resentfully. Officer Wang shot him a cold look and then said, "Wangu Grotto Heaven covers a large area, and it covers 4 mountains around it." I said, "On this mountain," because those 4 peaks indeed belong to a single peak of Mount Wangu. The reason I said it's not on the mountain is because the 4 peaks of Wangu Grotto Heaven are completely concealed by the formation. If you stand outside, you won't be able to see any trace of it. Wangu Grotto Heaven actually occupied 4 mountain peaks. A mountain might not sound big, but in fact, those who had climbed mountains knew that ordinary people might not be able to climb a mountain in an entire day. It was normal for a mountain peak to be built with thousands of people living in it. One mountain peak was already like this, but Wangu Grotto Heaven actually occupied 4. What shocked me the most was that the 4 mountain peaks were completely covered by a formation. The ancestor of the Wang family, who opened up the Wanwu Grotto heaven, was quite generous. Such a terrifying move could only be done by someone with great cultivation. I searched around but didn't find the location of Wanwu heavenly abode. While I was astonished, the fatty wasn't convinced. He's a member of the Zhanyan sect, and has a profound attainment in formations. Back when we were at the foot of Mount Longhu, he helped me and Yi Pianpian defeat the Taoist priests of Mount Longhu led by Chen Yangting. When he heard Officer Wang talk about formations, he thought for a moment and then sneered. If there's really a formation covering the 4 peaks, not to mention how high the cultivation of the person who set it up must be, the coverage of the formation must be very wide. But we've been walking for a long time today, but I haven't seen any trace of the formation. Don't try to fool us. Officer Wang turned to look at the fatty, and spat out 2 words coldly. Ignorant. The fatty was angry. Officer Wang, I'm not as good as you in terms of cultivation, but don't try to fool me in terms of formations. Officer Wang interrupted him rudely. The mountain-guarding formation of Wanwu Grotto Heaven was set up by the ancestor of the Wang family. It's normal that you can't find any trace of the formation. If you could find any trace of it, our Wang family wouldn't have been able to survive for thousands of years. I frowned. The ancestor of the Wang family, Wang Jun of Xiqing City, was the teacher of Mao Ying, the founder of the Shangqing sect. It was said that he was an immortal who had become an immortal. If he had set up a formation, it was normal that the fatty couldn't see any trace of it. Officer Wang's words made sense. However, his attitude made me a little uncomfortable. Both of them were my close friends, and my friendship with the fatty was much closer than Officer Wang's. It seemed they still wanted to argue. I coldly glanced at Officer Wang and interrupted him. We'll know the truth after we go there. Officer Wang, lead the way. Officer Wang seemed to hear the displeasure in my words. He didn't dare to argue with the fatty anymore. He even cupped his hands to apologize to the fatty. Then, he led the way. I followed him and couldn't help but feel puzzled. Judging from their argument, it was clear that Officer Wang was in the right. However, because of what I said, he took the initiative to apologize to the fatty. His attitude was as if he had recognized himself as a servant. This was the Wang family that had existed for 2,000 years and ranked first among the 10 heavenly paradises. Whether it was Wang Can's identity as a sage, the 9 Cauldrons clan, or my previous life, they were all ancient things. I really didn't know what had happened thousands of years ago to make the Wang family so obedient to me and not change their original intention. While I was thinking about these questions, Officer Wang stopped and turned to me with a smile. Sage, we're here. I stopped and looked up. This was the peak that Officer Wang had pointed at. However, we were surrounded by jungle, and I could vaguely hear the chirping of birds and insects. This place was even more remote than the dilapidated temple. Except for the animal path under my feet, I couldn't see any traces of living beings. The fatty also looked around. Apparently, he wanted to find the traces of the formation. However, after a while, he couldn't find anything. He couldn't help but ask, "There's nothing here. Where is the entrance you mentioned? Is it in the trees ahead?" Officer Wang didn't dare to argue with the fatty anymore. He simply ignored him and said to me respectfully, "I'm going to activate the formation. You might feel uncomfortable when you enter it for the first time. Sage, please pay attention." Uncomfortable? I didn't mind it and nodded at Officer Wang. Although I didn't know much about formations, with my current cultivation base, even if I felt uncomfortable, it would be very slight. After notifying me, Officer Wang slowly raised his hands, and a mass of green light gushed out of his palms, instantly covering the 3 of us. As the green light hovered, the surrounding scenery disappeared. Vaguely, I saw a white light shoot out from the trees ahead, echoing with the rotating green light. When the two gradually merged into one, I felt a white light burst out of my body. Then, 7-colored light flashed back and forth, and there was nothing under my feet. This feeling of weightlessness only lasted for a moment. Then, the 7-colored light faded away, and I was back on solid ground. When I opened my eyes again, I found that the surroundings had changed. It was a Taoist hall, which was simple and didn't have many decorations. It wasn't as luxurious as the royal palace, but its grandeur wasn't inferior to the royal palace. Besides the hall, the first thing I felt was the rich spiritual energy blowing in my face. The spiritual qi in this place was so abundant that the Taoist qi in my body circulated much faster than usual. I felt so comfortable and relaxed, like a fish returning to the water and getting rid of its shackles. Is this the blessed enclave? It's really extraordinary. At this moment, there were several cultivators in gray robes standing next to the hall. From the fluctuations of their Taoist energy, I could tell that they were all heavenly masters. Among them were the 5 elders of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth that I had met before, as well as a few others that I hadn't seen before. Officer Wang took the first step forward and stood side by side with the heavenly masters. He knelt on one knee and cupped his hands at me. Officer Wang and the Holy Spirit Guard welcome the sage to Wanwu Grotto Heaven. This wasn't the first time that Officer Wang and the others had saluted me. I still felt uncomfortable, but I didn't refuse them this time. I calmed myself down, cleared my throat, and said indifferently, "Get up. There's no need to be so polite." "Yes." Officer Wang nodded and then stood up. The other heavenly masters in gray robes also stood up and stood behind Officer Wang with their hands clasped behind their back. The 5 elders of metal, wood, water, fire, and earth were all here, and Fu was with Officer Wang. However, Ah Lu, Ah Shou, and the others weren't here. I asked Officer Wang, "Where are Ah Lu, Ah Shi, and the others?" "They were seriously injured in Chio's tomb." "How are they now?" "Their injuries have healed, and they are entertaining other guests. If the sage wants to see them, I can summon them here," Officer Wang said with a smile. I shook my head. Officer Wang had summoned me to attend the heavenly grand ritual. Of course, other guests would come to watch the ceremony. There were many things to do, so I didn't want to add to his troubles. After walking out of the hall, I saw a wide stone staircase in front of me. The stone staircase extended to a very far distance. I found that the hall was built on a very high mountain peak, and there were clouds and mist hovering under our feet. After walking down the stone staircase for a short distance, we passed through the clouds. When I looked down, I saw that there was still a long way to go. I was surprised. Mount Wanwu wasn't famous for its precipitous cliffs, but in this heavenly paradise, there were such magnificent buildings. They weren't inferior to those steep mountains. Officer Wang seemed to see my surprise. He smiled and explained to me, "This stone staircase is called the Heavenly Staircase. It's the most dangerous place in our Wanwu paradise. Sage, please come over here." While talking, he pointed at a cliff on the left. I lifted my head to look. There was a pavilion there. It had an ancient style, and it contrasted well with the surrounding scenery. It was extremely beautiful. I nodded my head and lifted my foot to walk over. This platform is called the Immortals Viewing Platform. Standing here, you can see the whole picture of our Wanwu paradise. Officer Wang smiled and continued to talk to me. "Sage, take a look." I looked in the direction he was pointing. Sure enough, when I stood there, I could see the surrounding mountains and peak. After looking at it for a while, I felt refreshed. When I was about to look away, I found that something was wrong. My face changed, and I took a deep breath. Officer Wang saw my expression and smiled. He said, "Sage, you must have seen the Wang family's true dragon veins." After a while, I slowly exhaled. The shock in my eyes hadn't disappeared. I turned to look at Officer Wang and asked with uncertainty, "Are there 4 true dragon veins here?" The value of the true dragon veins was indescribable. In the secular world, the powerful Metaphysics Society only had one true dragon vein. Even Mount Longhu, which controlled all the Taoist sects in the world, only had 3 true dragon veins. But this Wanwu paradise had 4. It was worthy of being called the world's #1 paradise. I wasn't the only one who was shocked. The fat man next to me also forgot to quarrel with Officer Wang. He opened his eyes wide and gulped. He asked me doubtfully, "Third baby, am I seeing things? Are they true dragon veins?" Chapter 568. There were 4 true dragon veins. After figuring this out, the fat man screamed, "Since when did the dragon veins become so worthless? How could it be possible to have 4 of them?" Wang Can still ignored him and answered me with a smile, "Sage, you have good eyesight. The 4 peaks of Wanwu Grotto Heaven were formed by the 4 dragon veins that our ancestors collected. For thousands of years, they have been the top of the 10 great grotto heavens. That's why." He was right. Just these 4 true dragon veins were enough to support Wanwu Grotto Heaven to stand firm in the world for thousands of years. The only thing that puzzled me was that the Wang family cultivated witchcraft qi. Although the 4 true dragon veins were rare, they could only absorb Taoist qi from them, not witchcraft qi. Since the true dragon veins were transformed from the Tai Sui's corpse, there should be something mysterious about the 4 true dragon veins of the Wang family. I didn't ask further and followed Wang Can. The heavenly stairway was surrounded by lush mountains and forests. I could vaguely see pavilions and cranes flying back and forth. It was as if I had arrived in a fairyland. After climbing the heavenly stairway, Wang Can took me to a Taoist palace. The Taoist palace was built on a lake. It had only 2 floors, and the decoration was simple but exquisite. The most amazing thing was that it was in the middle of the 4 dragon veins. When I looked up, I saw a stream flowing out of each of the 4 dragon veins. There seemed to be an underground spring under the stream, so the water didn't flow down. Instead, it flowed upstream and converged into a lake in the middle. This Taoist palace is where the ancestors of the Wang family cultivated. Wang Can pointed at it and gave me a brief introduction. Then, he said respectfully, "Sage, you must be tired after such a long journey. You might as well take a rest here. Tomorrow, if you are interested, I will take you to see the other sceneries in the Grotto Heaven." I had to admit that Wang Can had arranged everything very well. He even used the Wang family's ancestors' cultivation place as a place for me to stay. I was flattered by his kindness. After I nodded, Officer Wang left with his people. Before leaving, he told me that if I needed anything, I could use the sound-transmitting talisman he had given me to contact him. After Officer Wang left, the fat man was still amazed. He pointed at the lake under the Taoist palace and asked me, "Third baby, if I'm not mistaken, this lake is formed by the spiritual energy of the 4 true dragon veins, right? Isn't the Wang clan a little too shocking?" "That's right." I nodded with a bitter smile. From the strength that the Wang family had displayed earlier, as well as their reputation as the head of the 10 great paradises, I already knew that they were extraordinary. However, even so, I did not dare to imagine that the Wang family's foundation was actually this terrifying. The spiritual energy in the lake in front of me was extremely rich, and even the color of the water was dark green. From a distance, it looked like a huge emerald. Although I had some unpleasantness with Officer Wang, the fat man was heartless and had already forgotten about it. With a cheerful face, he walked toward the Taoist palace. As he walked, he said excitedly, "The spiritual energy here is so rich. If I cultivate here for 2 days, my cultivation will definitely increase a lot. Maybe I can also break through to the Celestial Master Realm." His plan was good, but I didn't think so. I shook my head and said, "If you meditate and cultivate by the lake, it will be possible. However, in the Taoist palace, it is impossible for your cultivation to increase." After hearing that, the fat man asked me doubtfully, "That's impossible. The spiritual energy in the lake is so rich, and the Taoist palace was built on the lake on purpose. Moreover, it is the place where the Wang family's ancestor cultivated. The Taoist qi here should be even richer. Why can't my cultivation increase? I smiled and didn't answer him. I just told him to enter the Taoist palace and feel it for a while. At this time, the two of us had reached the entrance of the Taoist palace. The fat man took 2 steps forward and entered the Taoist palace first. As soon as he entered, his face changed. He turned to look at me with a strange face and asked in surprise, "You're right." When I stood at the entrance, I felt that the Taoist qi was extremely rich. How come there was no Taoist qi when I entered the door? How could this be? I followed him in. After sensing for a while, I confirmed my guess and explained to the fat man. The Wang family is one of the 9 cauldrons, and they cultivate sorcery qi. If there is only the Taoist qi formed by the true dragon vein here, then the Wang family's ancestor couldn't cultivate. Although I don't know what method the Wang family used, the huge amount of true dragon qi in the lake has been restored to the original sorcery qi in the Taoist palace. As I explained to the fat man, I was also shocked. The true dragon vein was formed by the Tai Sui's corpse, so it was very common for sorcery qi to be converted to Taoist qi. However, until now, it was the first time that I had seen someone restore Taoist qi to sorcery qi. The Wang family's method was really shocking. In fact, I was only guessing until I entered the Taoist palace and sensed the aura of sorcery qi. Apart from the Tai Sui's corpse, there was no other place where sorcery qi existed in the world. Hence, I couldn't cultivate sorcery qi on my own for a long time. This was the first time I had sensed sorcery qi from a non-Tai Sui corpse in this Taoist palace. Not only that, but the density of the sorcery qi here was even higher than what I had sensed from Shaojin. Back in the Corpse Yin sect, the dying Tai Sui had infused me with sorcery qi. I had basically digested all of it, so I could use this opportunity to absorb it properly. Although the fat man's family was also a descendant of the 9 cauldrons, it had ended in his father's generation. Lin Acheng cultivated sorcery qi, while the fat man cultivated orthodox Taoist technique. It was still within the scope of Taoist qi, so it was normal that he couldn't understand the profoundness of it. After listening to my explanation, he finally understood. He didn't know the subtle differences in the transformation of witchcraft, so he wasn't surprised or went out to cultivate. Instead, he casually pulled a chair over and sat on it. This guy was probably exhausted today. After sitting down, he complained, "It's like living in ancient times. Even the chairs are made of wood. It's not comfortable to sit on. The Wang family has such a big family business, but they don't know how to enjoy themselves." I also sat down beside him and touched the chair under me. I smiled at the fat man and said, "This chair is also a good thing." "Good thing?" The fat man snorted and said disdainfully, "Even if it's a precious antique, it's useless if it's uncomfortable to sit on." "Try to circulate your Tao Qi now," I said to the fat man with a smile. The fat man looked at me suspiciously, then closed his eyes and circulated his Tao Qi. After a while, the fat man suddenly opened his eyes and looked at me in disbelief. "Did you feel it?" I smiled and continued, "Stand up and try again." The fatty still had that expression of disbelief on his face. He stood up and deliberately took a few more steps away from the chair. Only then did he circulate his Tao Qi again. After opening his eyes again, the fat man shakily walked to the front of the chair and gently touched the back of the chair. "This chair can increase the speed of the Tao Qi circulation?" "That's right." I nodded and had the same expression. The wood used to make this chair is called Xian Yin wood. It's not a simple one. Xian Yin wood? The fat man frowned and thought for a while. Then, he shook his head. "I've never heard of it. However, from the name, it's obviously some kind of wood with dense yin energy. Logically speaking, it shouldn't have the effect of increasing the speed of the Tao Qi circulation." "Xian Yin wood. You only said the word "een," I explained to the fat man. This Xian wood does grow in a place with extreme Yin energy. However, when it was growing, it wasn't called Xian wood but extreme Yin wood. To ghosts or cultivators that cultivate Yin energy, extreme Yin wood is a priceless treasure. However, to other people, it doesn't have any special effect. It's just an ordinary item. How did it become Xian wood? Heavenly lightning. I pointed at the sky and adjusted my posture to make myself comfortable as I leaned against the back of the chair. To be exact, on the double Yang day, the rare autumn lightning strikes the extreme Yin wood. The wood that was forcefully chopped off from the book became the Xian wood. The double Yang day is the day when the Yang energy is the strongest. In addition, the heavenly lightning dispels evil. After being cleansed, the Yin and Yang energy in the Xian wood blends together. With the mutual effects, it has the effect of increasing the cultivation speed of any cultivator. Chapter 569. I sighed and pointed at the vase on the table. Let's not talk about the chair. This vase also has a long history. The fat man had learned his lesson this time. He carefully picked up the vase and shook it. Then, he asked, "What kind of treasure is this?" "It looks like a magic tool." He found a clue. He gathered his Tao energy from his fingertip and slowly poured it into the vase. After a long time, the vase didn't have any reaction. Those below the heavenly master level can't activate this magic tool. "Give it to me." I took the vase from the fat man's hand and played with it. This vase was made of porcelain. Its entire body was overflowing with light. At first glance, I knew it wasn't an ordinary item. The white base of the vase was painted with green and red colors. Ancient trees with twisted roots were drawn. It was easy to see that the person who painted this vase was very skilled. The ancient trees gathered on the vase looked like a living forest. "Didn't you want to show me? Why are you admiring it?" the fat man urged when he saw that I didn't respond. "I can't do it here. I have to go out and show you." I held the neck of the vase with one hand and supported it with the other as I walked out of the building. I left the stone path outside the building and chose a relatively wide lawn. I turned around and looked at the fat man. "Watch carefully." Then, I circulated the true essence in my body and slowly poured it into the vase. The moment my Zhen Yuan came into contact with the bottle, the green and red ancient trees on the bottle suddenly lit up. As I poured more and more Zhen Yuan into the bottle, I could even faintly feel the existence of the ancient trees. I had seen this kind of porcelain vase in Taoist scriptures. It was called the Yin-Yang Rui vase. The so-called Yin-Yang Rui vase was to seal something that was about to die inside the vase. In the future, the sealed thing could be summoned out through a spell. This kind of act of stealing the sky and changing the sun actually disturbed the yin and yang. It forcefully kept the dying thing inside the vase. That was why it was called the Yin-Yang Rui vase. Although this thing was rare, it was not very precious. This was because most of the Yin-Yang Rui vases could only contain some flowers and plants. Those that could contain birds and beasts were already of a very high grade. As for those that could contain people, whether they were ordinary people or cultivators, it was a quality that could only be encountered by chance. Since ancient times there were not many that could do so. According to the Taoist scripture I've read, there have been 2 confirmed cases in history. One of them was an ancient emperor who couldn't accept the fact that his concubine was dying of a serious illness. He found a cultivator to make a yin and yang rui vase and sealed his beloved concubine's soul and body in the vase. The other one was vague, only saying that there was an evil being that could not be completely destroyed sealed within. As for the one in my hand, according to the patterns on the vase, there are only some ancient trees sealed inside, so it's not that rare. However, I was still excited. This was the first time I had seen this kind of yin-yang rui vase. As the true essence slowly poured into the vase, I saw the ancient tree on the vase become brighter and brighter, as if it had gained some vitality. When I felt that the time was right, my mind flickered. I controlled my Tao energy and gathered it on one of the crooked trees. The patterns on the tree shone brightly. After the light faded, the ancient tree I had chosen began to move. Its branches and leaves shivered as if they were swaying in the wind. Then, I didn't know what to do. I carefully controlled my Tao energy and circulated it around the ancient tree, trying to summon it. Unexpectedly, the ancient tree just shivered. No matter how hard I tried, it didn't react. After a long time, I was a little impatient. I transferred my true essence and changed it to another tree. This time, it was different from the previous time. The ancient tree looked very thick. When it came in contact with my true essence, it also emitted light. Then, the light slowly gathered at the mouth of the vase. I could feel the Tao energy and true essence in the vase moving together with the light toward the mouth of the vase. Not long after that, I heard a clattering sound. It seemed something had fallen into the vase. What's going on? I was bewildered. This was different from what the Taoist scriptures had said. It should have directly summoned an ancient tree. How could this be? Third baby, you've been dawdling for a long time. What did you get? The fat man saw me standing there in a daze, so he craned his neck to look at me. I held the bottle and gently tipped it out. A green seed rolled out of the bottle. Logically speaking, it should have summoned the ancient tree. I looked at the vase. The thick ancient tree had disappeared. I explained to the fat man, but I don't know why it became this thing. The fat man saw that it was just a seed, so he lost interest. I was also a little dispirited. I put the seed in my pocket and walked back with the vase. However, what I didn't notice was that on the side of the crooked tree pattern that I had poured my true essence into for the first time, a vague figure suddenly appeared. This figure was colorful and looked like a woman. It seemed to be able to move. She carefully hid behind the tree and glanced outside. Then, she disappeared. After studying the ancient vase, the fat man lost interest. He went to the lake outside to meditate and cultivate. I also returned to the Taoist palace. Seizing this rare opportunity, I tried my best to absorb the surrounding witchcraft energy. After cultivating for a few days, I opened my eyes. It was already evening, and the sun was hanging on the horizon. I heard some noises outside. I got up and pushed the door open. A golden ray of sunlight shone into the small building, illuminating the hall. In the twilight, I saw a crane as tall as a human. It stood on the table with its slender neck and was combing the feathers on its back. I was surprised by the crane's posture. It was elegant and white, just like a fairy from heaven. The crane seemed to feel my gaze. It looked at me like a human and stopped combing its feathers. I hesitated for a while, then tried to approach it. The crane wasn't afraid of people. It just stood there and looked at me. When I came close, it stretched its head and rubbed my arm. This crane was completely different from the cranes in the mortal world. It looked elegant and full of spirit energy. It looked like a celestial spirit bird that I had seen in movies. I wondered how the Wang family had trained such a creature. I was excited to see it, so I curiously stroked its soft, fluffy feathers. Unexpectedly, as soon as I touched it, the crane shook its feathers and spread its wings. A feather fell from its armpit. The feather fluttered even though there was no wind, slowly falling in front of me. I reached out to catch the feather. The moment my fingers touched it, a weak flow of true qi was transmitted to me. I've prepared a banquet. We're waiting for the sage's arrival. Follow the crane. It was Wang Can's familiar voice again. I squeezed the feather in my hand and didn't know whether to laugh or cry. This fellow always made things complicated. He had sent me a sound-transmitting talisman, and now he had sent a crane to show me the way. Looking at the cranes flapping their wings and blinking at me, I thought for a while and understood. Wang Can had grown up in this blessed enclave. These Taoist techniques that I found a little strange were something he had been used to since he was a child. After all, the blessed heavenly abode was isolated from the rest of the world. No matter how they talked or behaved, they all looked ancient. I guessed it had been like this for thousands of years. The crane was very intelligent. Seeing that I hadn't moved for a long time, it seemed to be impatient. It flapped its wings and urged me to move faster. I went out and asked the fatty to go with me. However, the fatty seemed to be immersed in his cultivation and directly refused me. I didn't force him and went out on my own. When the crane saw me go out, it flapped its wings and flew up. At first, it hovered in the air. When it flew out of the small building, it spread its wings and soared into the sky, circling above my head to show me the way. Seeing this, I couldn't help but remember the crane pendant I had used to bless Lu Qingji. At that time, after I had poured my Taoist energy into the pendant, the crane had spread its wings and led the way for Lu Qingji. Who would have thought that today I would actually see a real immortal crane leading the way for me, leading me forward? I liked the spiritual crane very much, and it reminded me of the Qilin in Chio's tomb. When I had first entered the Green Mountains Kingdom, I had asked the Qilin to stay in the Devil Refining Gourd to cultivate. After that, I had traveled all the way. When I returned to Shenzhen, I met Lu Zhenyang. When he took the Devil Refining Gourd away, I didn't have time to release the Qilin. I didn't know how it was now. Lu Zhenyang didn't know how to use the Devil Refining Gourd, so the Qilin should be safe in there. Although the Qilin, which looked like a big dog, didn't have much power and didn't have a good temper, its intelligence wasn't worse than the crane's. I followed the crane and walked down the mountain. Slowly, the road in front of me became wider and wider. In the end, it became a bluestone road, and the terrain gradually became flat. I knew we were going down the mountain. Looking back, I saw that the mountain ridge behind me was hidden in the clouds, and I couldn't see the Taoist palace where I had lived. I continued to walk along the bluestone road. There were still lush trees on both sides of the road. I didn't see any buildings or people. There shouldn't be many people living in the Wangu Grotto heaven, and they were scattered across the mountains. It was normal to have such a sparse population. After walking for a long time, I vaguely saw a hall in front of me. Although it was exquisite, it wasn't as magnificent as the one I had seen when I had first entered the grotto heaven. Chapter 570. As soon as I entered the hall, a young man in a white robe came to greet me. He bowed to me and said respectfully, "Sage, this way, please." I had already gotten used to hearing Wang can call me Sage, but I didn't recognize this young man. Hearing him call me Sage, I felt a little awkward, but I didn't say anything. I just nodded and followed him into the hall. There were many winding corridors in the hall. It was like a labyrinth with hundreds of twists and turns. It was very complicated. If I had come here alone, I would have been confused. It was no wonder that Wang Can had left someone here to guide me. There was no scenery in the hall. I looked at the young man who was leading the way. He seemed to be in his 20s, but he had the glorious knowledge cultivation base. I couldn't help but feel surprised. The glorious knowledge cultivation base wasn't low. In Longhu Mountain, it was enough to be a hall master. Apart from the heavenly masters who rarely showed up, the glorious knowledge cultivation base was considered the backbone of the metaphysics world. Moreover, this young man should be a rare genius in the metaphysics world. I was curious, so I asked, "What's your name?" The young man in the white robe turned his head. His face was still respectful as he answered in a low voice, "My name is Chunning." Such a talented young man was just a servant of the Wang family. I couldn't help but sigh at the profound heritage of the blessed enclave. However, after thinking about it, even a young god celestial master like Afu was just a servant of the Wang family. This young man was nothing. I nodded and didn't say anything. I motioned for him to continue leading the way. After walking for a few minutes, I saw a hall in front of me. Chunning walked to the door and bowed, indicating that I had arrived. As soon as I entered the hall, Wang Ken came to greet me. He greeted me with a smile and said, "The banquet has begun. Sage, you've finally arrived." "The banquet has begun? Have the guests from the other blessed enclaves arrived?" I asked. Before coming here, Wang Can had told me that we were going to participate in the heavenly grand ritual and that the guests from the other blessed enclaves would come. Wang Can nodded and said, "The heavenly grand ritual will begin in 3 days. The blessed enclaves are scattered all over the place. Half a month ago, people arrived one after another. I've been taking care of guests for the past few days, so I'm really busy. Otherwise, I would have personally welcomed you just now." I shook my head. "If you have something to do, then do it. There's no need for me to participate in this banquet. Apart from you, I don't know anyone else in the Blessed Enclave." When Wang Can heard that, he said, "How can we do that? My Wang family is only the Holy Spirit guard of the sage. You can represent the Wang family more. During the heavenly grand ritual, I will announce your identity. From now on, the people of the blessed paradise will treat you as the Wang family's patriarch. Sage, you must attend this banquet." I was bewildered. After thinking for a while, I denied Wang Can's words. "It's better not to introduce me to them. I have disputes with many forces in the metaphysics world outside. Although the Blessed Enclave is hidden from the world, it is also inextricably linked to the metaphysics world. I don't want to implicate the Wanwu Grotto Heaven because of me." After hearing my words, Wang Can was a little confused. He didn't seem to agree with me, so he said, "The mortal world is connected to the Blessed Enclave, but why should we care about them? To the Blessed Enclave, the mortal world is like a cultivator to an ordinary person. Sage, you're overthinking things." He didn't care about the mortal world and always felt that he was superior. However, I knew that there were existences in the mortal world that they couldn't afford to provoke. For example, the current Heavenly Master of Mount Longhu and the Patriarch of the Metaphysics Society. So, I shook my head and insisted on my opinion. When Wang Can saw that I had made up my mind, he nodded and agreed. Then, he asked me, how should I introduce myself to the outsiders? After a brief discussion, we decided that I would be the Wang family's foreign minister. If I were the Wang family's foreign minister, I wouldn't need to attend today's banquet. However, Wang Can insisted that I go. I also wanted to see what was so special about the other blessed enclaves. So, I decided to attend the banquet. After making the decision, Wang Can and I walked into the hall together. After a few steps, I was stunned. I raised my head and looked at the corridor in front of me. On both sides of the corridor stood a row of young girls in palace dresses. They were holding lotus lanterns in their hands, which were the source of light in the hall. I was surprised by the number of maids and their motionless postures. However, when I took a closer look, I found that those girls weren't real people but stone statues. However, they were very lifelike, and their skin color was no different from that of ordinary people. They were also wearing silk palace dresses. At first glance, they could be mistaken for real. When Wang Can saw that I had noticed those statues, he smiled and said, "Sage, the banquet is in front of us. Dozens of people from the blessed enclave have arrived and are waiting there." I waved my hand. "If you want to hide your identity, you don't need to call me Sage anymore. Just call me Brother Zhou." Wang Can seemed to be a little uncomfortable. After hesitating for a while, he finally said, Brother Zhou, let's go in." I nodded and pushed open a heavy door with complicated carvings. The door seemed to have good soundproofing. At first, it was quiet, but when I pushed open the door, a wave of sound hit my face. I looked up and saw a spacious hall behind the door. It was decorated in an antique style, and there were rows of red-painted pillars around it. In the middle of the hall, short and exquisite long tables were placed in a regular pattern. There were dozens of them. At this moment, people were sitting cross-legged at each table. They were eating and talking. Many of them even stood up to talk to the people at the other tables. They were the ones who had made the loud sound in the hall. I sensed their cultivation base and found it strange. Except for a few people who had the aura of a heavenly master, most of them were below the heavenly master realm. How could the cultivation base of those people from the blessed enclave be so low? At this moment, Wang Can whispered to me, "Those are the servants and attendants from the blessed enclave. Sage. Brother Zhou, don't mind them. Let's go to the inner room. The people from the blessed enclave are waiting there." I understood now. No wonder those people in the hall didn't have a high cultivation base and looked young. They were just attendants. Speaking of attendants, those people's cultivation base wasn't low. Half of them had the heavenly master realm, and the rest had the glorious knowledge realm. In the secular world, they were a powerful force. The most frightening thing about the so-called blessed enclave wasn't the heavenly masters or the young god celestial masters, but the servants and attendants. The glorious knowledge realm was a very high cultivation base in the secular world, but it was ordinary in this place. It was because of their strong foundation that their overall strength was so terrifying. I nodded and glanced around before walking in. As soon as we entered the room, those people seemed to hear us. They all turned around and looked at me and Wang Can. Since our statuses were different, Wang Can didn't pay attention to those people. He didn't even look at them. He just took me past them and went to the other side of the hall. There was also a huge wooden door carved with complicated patterns. Since I had to hide my identity, I was just a foreign officer of the Wang family, so it wasn't appropriate for me to walk in front of Wang Can. This time, Wang Can walked in front of me. After pushing the door open, he walked in first, and I followed behind him. Just like in the hall outside, there were also some short tables placed here, only divided into 2 rows. The people inside sat at each table, and there were also people chatting, but because there were fewer people inside, it was not as noisy as outside. After we walked in, we also attracted everyone's attention. However, most of their eyes were focused on Wang Can, and no one paid attention to me. I followed behind him. While walking forward, I observed the people from the other paradises and blessed land. Among those people, some were wearing old-fashioned cotton shirts, some were wearing suits and ties, and some were dressed casually. However, most of them were wearing Taoist robes like Wang Can. Since the Heavenly Dipper 9 steps contained the bright insight technique, I could easily see other people's cultivation base. He scanned the surroundings roughly. Among the people he saw, there were rarely any ordinary heavenly masters. Most of them were young spirit experts. Chapter 571. Officer Wang's face didn't change. Apparently, he was used to this. While walking forward, he whispered to me, "These are the representatives from the other paradises. Only 2 of the 10 major paradises are here, and most of them are from the 36 minor paradises and the 72 paradises." Following his introduction, we came to the center of the room. There was a short table, which was separate from the other 2 rows of short tables. Apparently, it was the main seat reserved for the Wanwu paradise. Someone was sitting at the table. He was tall and wore a gray robe. He was Ah Fu, who I had known for a while. Although he was a servant, his young god celestial master cultivation base gave him the qualification to represent the Wang family at this banquet. Before we arrived, he was the one who had been entertaining the guests. When Ah Fu saw me, he stood up and was about to salute me. I shook my head at him, took 2 steps forward, and sat next to him. After I sat down, Ah Fu understood what I meant and didn't say anything. Officer Wang picked up a glass of wine from the table and said to the crowd, "Today's banquet is to welcome all of my fellow Taoists. Please raise your glasses and drink with me. After that, the banquet will begin. I hope you can forgive us if we haven't received you well." Then, he picked up his glass and drained it in one gulp. After the others also drank, he smiled and apologized. Then, he sat next to me. After we were all seated, a young man in a suit and gold-rimmed glasses came over with a glass of wine. I followed the voice and saw that the man was wearing a neat suit. He had a square face and a warm expression. He didn't look like a cultivator, but a business elite from a multinational company. However, he had the cultivation base of a heavenly master, which scared me. He smiled and chatted with Officer Wang for a while. Then, he turned to me and asked Officer Wang, "Brother Wang, this fellow Taoist looks unfamiliar. May I know who he is?" "This is Mr. Zhou, the Wang family's foreign advisor," Officer Wang introduced him. Then, he pointed at the man and said to me, "This is Jiang Ziwen, Brother Jiang. He is the young master of the Heavenly Eye Paradise. The Heaven Eye Grotto Heaven is located in Suhang and is very close to the mortal world. They often have business dealings with each other. When it comes to making money, the Heaven Eye Grotto Heaven is undoubtedly the #1 grotto heaven. Tianmu Paradise should be one of the 36 lesser paradises. In terms of status, it was a notch lower than Wangu Paradise. However, the man in the suit did not seem to have much respect for Officer Wang. After listening to the introduction of both sides, he was obviously a little dissatisfied. When he was about to say something, a slightly shrill voice next to him interrupted. "Hey, when did such a person appear in your Wangu cave?" "Mr. Zhou. He is just at the early stage of the Celestial Master realm." How dare he call himself Mr.? I turned my head and saw a young man in a black Taoist robe. He was holding a quilt in his hand. He had a fair face and a pair of triangular eyes. He was looking at me and Wang Can, seeing us turn our heads. He didn't restrain himself and continued to tease us. "Wang Can, has your Wanwu wonderland fallen to such a state?" He deliberately spoke in a loud voice. When the people around him heard it, they immediately burst into laughter. I didn't care about his sarcasm, but my heart sank when I heard the laughter. It was obvious that the people who were laughing were those who didn't get along with Wanwu Cave. Wanwu Grotto Heaven ranked first among the 10 great grotto heavens, but because of the death of Wang Can's father, its strength was at its weakest at this time. It was like a baby holding a precious treasure in his hand. Anyone who saw it would want to snatch it. At the heavenly grand ritual, most of the blessed paradises would try to replace it. The young man in the black Taoist robe was just the first one to stand out. Officer Wang's face darkened. He coldly glanced at the young man and said, "Zhao Hao, you are just an ordinary celestial master. What qualifications do you have to say that?" "Ordinary celestial master?" Zhao Hao laughed with a hint of sarcasm on his face. "Officer Wang, you just became a celestial master a few days ago. How dare you talk to me like that?" After saying that, Zhao Hao's eyes narrowed. He opened his mouth and spat out a white gas. In the white gas, a cold light flashed, and a crystal-clear white jade Dao sword appeared. It floated 1 foot in front of him. Even though it was far away from me, I could still feel a surging sword essence. A sword cultivator. When I saw the white jade Dao sword, I instantly recalled the old Taoist, Huang Zhu, and Mo's background that Officer Wang had told me about. Could this Zhao Hao be a member of Xuanda Cave? While I was shocked, Officer Wang's face changed greatly. He stared at the white jade Dao sword and said in shock, "Refining the sword like jade. You have reached the Celestial Master realm." Zhao Hao smiled proudly. He squinted at Officer Wang and said proudly, "I'm just a Celestial Master realm expert. If it weren't for this heavenly grand ritual, I would have already condensed the sword Wei True Spirit and achieved the Yang Spirit. I don't know who your Wanwu Cave will send this time. Officer Wang, I advise you not to fight this time. Otherwise, my Dao sword will not show any mercy." Hearing his blatant threat, Officer Wang's face suddenly became more unsightly. He had just entered the Celestial Master realm, and Zhao Hao's cultivation of the Celestial Master realm was not a lie, regardless of whether he could advance to the Yang Spirit at any time. In addition, he was a sword cultivator whose combat power was far superior to that of ordinary people. If they fought, Officer Wang's chance of winning was almost zero. Although cultivation was not the only thing that mattered in the arena, and talismans and magic treasures were all available, as people from the Blessed Enclave, no one lacked talismans or magic treasures. The huge gap in cultivation was the most fatal. Seeing that the atmosphere was a little awkward, a strong man sitting on the side tried to smooth things over. That's enough. We haven't seen each other for a long time. Don't quarrel as soon as we meet. Don't talk so much. Zhao Hao looked a little unforgiving, but when he heard the strong man's words, he curled his lips and angrily put the Dao sword back into his body. I looked up at the strong man who had spoken. I could feel the terrible fluctuations of Dao Qi in his body, but I couldn't see through his cultivation. Obviously, this strong man was a young spirit celestial master whose cultivation was far superior to mine. I curiously asked Officer Wang in a low voice, "Who is this person?" "He is the master of the mysterious treasure enclave. His name is Huang Fuxiu, and he is of the same generation as my father. We all call him Uncle Xiu." Officer Wang took a deep breath to suppress the anger in his heart. He slowly explained to me, "This person's cultivation is very high. Among all the young spirit celestial masters in the Blessed Enclave, he is also one of the top. However, the entire mysterious treasure enclave has withered. Except for him, there is not even an ordinary celestial master. There is a rumor that he alone obtained the mysterious treasure enclave's fate for 100 years. Because of this, the mysterious treasure enclave usually doesn't care about the ranking. This time, they just came to watch the heavenly grand ritual. He alone obtained the mysterious treasure enclave's fate for 100 years. Although I couldn't see through his cultivation, I could vaguely feel that this person was even more terrifying than the young spirit celestial masters that I had seen in the secular world. However, his name was interesting. Huang Fuxiu. Looking at his 2-meter-tall sturdy body, I couldn't understand why he had such a delicate name. At that moment, Huang Fuxiu looked at Zhao Hao and said, "Although this time, the heavenly grand ritual will rearrange the ranking in the arena, the most important thing is that the Blessed Enclave is offering sacrifices to the heavens. Do not put the cart before the horse. If the mysterious Virtue Enclave has other intentions, wait until the arena to compete." I was originally suspicious of Zhao Hao. After hearing this, I suddenly turned my head and asked Officer Wang, "That Zhao Hao is from the mysterious Virtue Enclave?" Officer Wang nodded and said somewhat dispiritedly, "That's right, it's them. Back then, we took in AMO not only because we were kind, but also because we wanted to suppress the mysterious Virtue Enclave's power. Although the mysterious Virtue Enclave is only one of the 36 minor enclaves, it is ranked first. It can be promoted to the top 10 enclaves at any time. However, our Wangwu Enclave has been going downhill for the past few years. Their goal this time is to replace us and enter the top 10 enclave." I nodded as I understood what he meant. The position of the Blessed Enclave's chief wasn't just an empty title. Officer Wang definitely wanted to fight for it. However, the power of the Wangwu Enclave had been declining. It was very unlikely that they would be able to keep their chief position. On the other side, Zhao Hao had calmed down and looked at Officer Wang and me. But at this moment, one of the servants behind him suddenly moved closer and whispered something into his ear. After Zhao Hao heard it, his eyes widened. His triangular eyes emitted an ominous glint as he glared fiercely at me. Chapter 572. Perhaps it was because he saw the coldness in my eyes, Zhao Hao's face flashed with anger. He stood up and walked towards me. When he was in front of me, his eyes were fierce. He asked me fiercely, "Boy, I heard that you want to steal something from my Schwanda Wonderland?" I was stunned at first, but then I realized that he was talking about AMO. I had just seen AMO, and Zhao Hao already knew about it. It was obvious that Schwanda Wonderland had planted a spy in Wangu Wonderland. Although the Wonderlands belonged to the same faction, they had deep conflicts with each other. They kept hindering each other openly and secretly. It was normal for spies to be planted. At this time, the hostile relationship between Wangu Wonderland and Schwanda Wonderland was obvious. Therefore, I didn't have any good ancient books. I sneered and said, "Yours? If I like something, it naturally belongs to me. What does it have to do with your Schwanda Wonderland?" Zhao Hao was furious. He sneered and said, "Boy, let me tell you. There are more than 100 Wonderlands, but only my Schwanda Wonderland is a sword cultivator. The natural sword embryo belongs to my Schwanda Wonderland. Even when Zhenren Wang was alive, he didn't dare to take it away." It really was about Amo. I sighed in my heart. My hatred for Schwanda Wonderland deepened. However, the Zhenren Wang he mentioned should be Officer Wang's father. According to Officer Wang, his father was a perfected immortal. Even Officer Wang's father didn't dare to take Imo away. What did he mean? Could it be that Schwanda Wonderland had some amazing means that could even keep a perfected immortal in check? Although I didn't understand the details, Amo's matter was too cruel. As long as there was a chance, I didn't want to let Zhao Hao have his way. I looked at him coldly and said in a deep voice, "The natural sword embryo you mentioned is a living person. I won't take it away, but with me around, don't even think about it." Zhao Hao sneered and said disdainfully, "It's something that even the Wang family can't stop. Do you think you can?" Of course, I couldn't do it alone. Not to mention Schwanda Wonderland's background, I might not even be a match for Zhao Hao at the Yang spirit realm. However, Officer Wang obeyed me. As long as I gave the order, Wangu Wonderland would naturally protect Imo. Although Schwanda Wonderland was strong, Wangu Wonderland had existed for thousands of years, so it wasn't easy to deal with them. It wouldn't be difficult for them to protect Imo. Without waiting for me to say anything, Zhao Hao stood up and gave me a sinister smile. "Looking at your cultivation, you should have been invited by the Wang family to participate in the All-Heaven Grand Competition, right? Fine, I'll remember you. You'd better pray that you don't meet me in the arena." Hao's words, Zhao of, and said. Wang and said. Wang Zhao Hao was, officer. And he Wang, even Huang Fuxiu, who had scolded Zhao Hao earlier, was playing with the wine glass in her hand in silence for some reason. After a moment of silence, I turned to Officer Wang and asked, "Zhao Hao said that only Schwanda Wonderland has sword cultivators. What does that mean? Also, are the other grotto heavens and blessed lands indifferent to little Amo's matter?" Officer Wang sighed and kept silent for a while. He looked ashamed and helpless. Amo's matter. It's hard to explain. He, his parents, and his ancestors were actually pregnant sword slaves raised by the Schwanda Grotto Heaven. Those slaves cultivate with swords for generations. It's okay if they're not talented, but if they're talented, they'll be refined into sword slaves, just like Amo and his parents. In the eyes of the other Wonderlands, it's just a family matter of Schwanda Wonderland. Naturally, no one will interfere. I was shocked. Now, I understood why Officer Wang looked guilty. No wonder he didn't tell me the truth. Imo and his parents were Schwanda Wonderland slaves, just like Ah Fu and Ah Shou. Those Wonderlands had been passed down for thousands of years. No one could guarantee that there would be experts in every generation. That was why they had to keep slaves. Even if their descendants weren't good enough, they would still have loyal servants to protect them. That way, their families wouldn't be destroyed. As for Schwanda Wonderland, it was just that their methods were crueler. It was no wonder that all the other Wonderlands kept silent about this matter. They were all jackals of the same tribe. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. When I opened my eyes again, they were clear again. I had temporarily put aside my extreme thoughts. Schwanda Wonderland was different after all. Even if the other Wonderlands kept slaves, they still treated them as human beings. For example, Officer Wang treated Ah Fu and the others. Although he called them master and servant, he still treated them politely. It was just like the relationship between a landlord and a tenant farmer in ancient times, or the relationship between a boss and an employee. However, Schwanda Wonderland refined people into sword slaves without intelligence. It was different in nature. At this moment, the atmosphere of the banquet was warm again. Officer Wang quickly adjusted his mood. He wore a faint smile on his face, which made people feel like they were bathing in the spring breeze. After receiving the guests who came to toast him, he excused himself to me. Then, he raised his glass and walked to the other tables. No matter what, he was the host, and he had to show his hospitality. I had nothing to do, and I didn't know anyone else. Of course, I didn't want to raise my glass. I simply focused on the dishes in front of me. I didn't know where Officer Wang had found a chef. The dishes in front of me looked exquisite, and they tasted great. I was used to eating delicacies at Wang Yongjun's place. After eating a few times, I felt my appetite was piqued. I guess the ingredients of the dishes in front of me were grown in this wonderland. They contained spiritual energy, which was why even ordinary dishes had flavors that I had never seen in the secular world. Besides the dishes, the wine in the porcelain bottle on the table wasn't ordinary, either. After I was full, I took out the small ball I had just taken out from the yin and yang rui vase. I played with it while I poured myself a glass of wine, waiting for the end of the banquet. Soon, I finished the bottle of wine. I smacked my lips and wanted more. I was about to call the waiter next to me to pour more wine. However, before I could open my mouth, I saw a milky white wine bottle in front of me. I lifted my head and saw a boy around Ah Mo's age standing by the table. He was the one who had placed the wine bottle on the table. I was a little surprised. This boy didn't look like a waiter here, be it his clothes or his age. Was he a member of the family that the person from the Wonderland had brought here? I smiled at him and asked, "Little friend, which family are you from?" The boy frowned and put down the wine bottle. He clasped his hands behind his back and answered, "I'm from the mysterious treasure Wonderland." His voice was crisp and tender, but his words were full of vicissitudes of life. I couldn't help but be startled by the way he addressed himself. The wine cup that was about to be brought to my mouth also stopped. The boy seemed to be used to my surprised expression. He poured himself a cup of wine and slowly drank a mouthful before sitting down on the empty seat beside me. Then, he said in an old voice, "I made some mistakes in my cultivation years ago. My body and appearance are a little strange. Taoist friend, you don't have to be surprised." I was a little suspicious at first, thinking that it was a child who was joking with me. However, after hearing his words, I was 80% convinced. There were many strange people in the world of metaphysics. It wasn't a big deal to maintain one's appearance forever in the mortal world. However, I found it strange that I couldn't see through the boy's cultivation after using my clear insight power. Could he be a young god celestial master? I pondered in my heart, but my expression didn't change. I asked indifferently, "What business does Taoist friend have with me?" The childlike old man frowned and pointed at my left hand. He asked, "Where did the thing in Taoist friend's hand come from?" I lowered my head and saw that the thing in my left hand was the seed that I had taken from the yin-yang rui vase. After a moment of silence, as I didn't understand what this person meant, I didn't tell the truth and casually replied, "This is a small thing that I picked up earlier." I felt that it was a little strange, so I kept it with me. "Why? Does Taoist friend recognize this thing? You picked it up?" The boy frowned and asked, "Where did you pick it up? Tell me the specific location and I can agree to one of your conditions." After hearing his words, I felt strange and didn't know how to reply. While I was silent, Huang Fu Xiu, who I had seen before, suddenly walked over. After seeing the boy, she respectfully bowed and asked, "Martial uncle, why are you here?" I saw an interesting little thing. The boy sighed. Then, he turned to look at me and said, I don't mind telling you that this thing is a seed that can grow into an ancient tree. The wood is an excellent material for making magic tools, but the method is very complicated. It won't be of much help to you. You might as well tell me the origin of this seed in exchange for some benefit. After saying that, the boy pondered for a moment and said, Didn't that boy from Schwanda Wonderland want to harm you? I'll give you a magic tool so that you can compete with him. I was stunned. I had only suspected it before, but when Huang Fu Xiu called him martial uncle, I was sure that the boy's cultivation was very high. The reason why there was no fluctuation of Tao energy was that I couldn't see it. Seeing that I didn't speak, Huang Fu Xiu frowned and said to me, My martial uncle always keeps his word. If you don't believe me, I can guarantee it. I remained silent. It wasn't that I doubted Huang Fu Xiu's credibility, but I was hesitant. I didn't know the origin of this thing. Moreover, I got it from the place where Wang Can's father cultivated. I didn't know if there were any secrets. Before I figured it out, I definitely couldn't tell this boy. Before I could think of a reason to reject him, the boy seemed to see my hesitation. He sighed and said in an old-fashioned tone, Think about it carefully. I won't leave before the heavenly grand ritual is completed. When you've thought it through, you can find me. With your current cultivation, you won't be able to last long against that boy from Schwanda Wonderland. You have to think it through. After saying that, he turned to leave with Huang Fu Xiu. I was stunned and asked, How should I address you, senior? Chapter 573. Song Feng. This old man's name is interesting. I looked at his back and thought to myself. At this moment, Officer Wang returned from toasting at another table. He followed my gaze and saw the child. His face changed as he blurted out, That old monster! Why is he here? Sage, are you all right? He was flustered, and he didn't even care how he addressed me. I shook my head. I'm fine. Is that child really an old man? Officer Wang heaved a sigh of relief when he saw that I was all right. He nodded and said, Yes, this man is very famous in the Blessed Enclave. I heard that he has lived for more than 200 years. We all secretly call him an old monster. More than 200 years old? I was surprised. Although cultivators could live longer than ordinary people, it was too exaggerated to say that a cultivator was more than 200 years old. It wasn't difficult for cultivators to obtain great power, but their lifespan was determined by fate. Since ancient times, very few people could go against the heavens and escape from the pursuit of the underworld. Officer Wang continued, I've heard my father talk about him. He came from the mysterious Wonderland, and his real name wasn't Song Feng. At that time, the Kunlun Mountain's earth dragon was rolling, and a crack appeared on the top of the mountain, revealing two swords. One of them was called Song Feng, and the other was called Unsheathing. It caused many people in the Blessed Enclave to fight for it. At that time, he won the Song Feng sword and became famous in the Blessed Enclave. Later, he seemed to be crazy about swords, so he changed his name to Song Feng. I thought his name was strange, but it turned out that he was named after a sword. It was interesting. I asked, What about the unsheathing sword? Did anyone get it? Officer Wang nodded. The one who got the unsheathing sword was his brother. My father told me that his brother's cultivation base was higher than his. When they were fighting for the two swords, thanks to his brother's help, they each got one. At that time, the two of them held the Song Feng sword and the unsheathing sword, and they were brothers. When they were in the heavenly master realm, they could suppress the Yang God's celestial master. Later, when they became Yang Gods, they became even more powerful. For decades, almost no one could compete with them. Fortunately, the mysterious Wonderland never wanted to compete. Otherwise, our Wanwu Wonderland wouldn't have been able to keep its position as the top heavenly abode. So powerful? I was startled. I had guessed that the old man was a Yang God Heavenly Master, but according to Officer Wang, I was afraid this old man, named Song Feng's cultivation base, wasn't just at the Yang God level. Yet. Wang Qin nodded with some emotion. There was a trace of fascination in his eyes. According to my father, no one in the Blessed Enclave dared to provoke these two brothers at that time. But later, they fought among themselves. Their fighting. I couldn't help but smile. Didn't you say that the brothers are connected? Why are they fighting? I don't know. I heard that it was because of a woman. Officer Wang shook his head. Apparently, he only knew a little about that history. He continued, after the fight between the two brothers, the elder brother died, and the hidden-edge sword disappeared for 100 years. When he reappeared, he looked like a child now. There is a popular saying that his body was destroyed in the war, and only his remnant soul survived with the hidden-edge sword in his hand. His childlike body was also transformed by the hidden-edge sword. Apart from that, his cultivation has completely disappeared. His cultivation disappeared? I couldn't help but feel embarrassed. I couldn't see through the child's cultivation base, so I thought that he was much stronger than me. It turned out that his cultivation base had disappeared. But if he didn't have any cultivation base, how could he have survived for so many years with the magical sword in his hand? I pondered for a long time, but I couldn't figure it out. At this moment, someone came over to propose a toast. Officer Wang greeted him with a smile and chatted with his family. I continued to drink as I turned my head to look at the mysterious treasure wonderland from the corner of my eye. At this moment, the hidden-edge sword was sitting cross-legged with his eyes closed. His hands were on his knees, and he seemed to be meditating. Huang Fuxiu, who was famous in the Blessed Enclave, knelt next to him with a distressed face. She looked helpless and said something carefully. I started to think about what Hidden Edge had said. He said that as long as I told him the origin of the seed, he would give me a magic tool that could help me fight against Zhao Hao. Zhao Hao was a real Seal Celestial Master at the Great Perfection Celestial Master Realm, and he was a sword cultivator. He didn't lack talismans or magic treasures. Among the Celestial Masters at the Great Perfection Celestial Master Realm, he was one of the best. He could even fight against the Yang God Celestial Master. With my current cultivation base, I didn't have much chance of winning if I fought against him. Moreover, my cultivation base was different from others. The old man only saw that I was at the early stage of the Celestial Master Realm. Even so, he still had the confidence to let me fight against Zhao Hao. From this, it could be seen that the magic tool he promised me was very powerful. Although the old man had lost his cultivation base, I didn't know why, but I believed what he said. After all, he was a legendary figure, so there was no need for him to lie to me. In fact, my real combat power was much higher than the early stage of the Celestial Master Realm. With my real strength and the magic tool he promised me, it shouldn't be a problem for me to defeat Zhao Hao. So, the question now was, should I exchange the vase for a magic tool? Exchanging an unknown vase for a magic tool that could defeat a Celestial Master at the Great Perfection Celestial Master Realm was not a bad deal. After a moment of silence, Officer Wang had finished chatting. I stopped him and asked, Officer Wang, the small building I'm staying in is the place where the ancestors of the Wang family have been practicing for a long time. Did your father leave all the things in there? Officer Wang nodded. Yes, after my father passed away, I never touched the things in there. I thought for a moment and asked, when your father passed away, did he tell you what extraordinary things he left behind? Officer Wang was puzzled by my question. He frowned and said, Our Wang family has been passed down for 2,000 years, and we have many magic tools and treasures. My father told me about them. As for the things in the small building, he never mentioned them to me. They shouldn't be anything rare. In that case, Officer Wang didn't know about the vase. I thought about it and decided that I didn't need to hide the relationship between Officer Wang and me. I directly mentioned the vase and described it to Officer Wang. Then, I asked him, "This vase is also called the yin and yang rui vase. Since it was left by your father, the things inside must have been sealed by your father. Why didn't he tell you anything? Did he forget about it?" Officer Wang shook his head. After thinking for a while, he said, "I don't know if my father forgot about it or not. However, our Wang family is the Holy Spirit guard of the sage. If the sage wants to study the Wang family's things, he can take them." I thought I could get some useful information from Officer Wang, but he didn't know anything about it. Now, I couldn't make up my mind. While playing with the seed in my hand, my mind was racing. From Song Feng's attitude, there was no doubt that he wanted to get this seed. At least, it proved that the yin and yang rui vase was extraordinary. Its value shouldn't be less than the magical tool he had promised me. He was an old monster that had lived for more than 200 years. He wouldn't do anything that would make him lose money. Could it be that this yin and yang rui vase was of the highest quality and could seal living people? I couldn't help but recall Officer Wang's words. Song Feng's body had been destroyed, and his soul was born from the hidden edge sword. Thinking of this, my mind flickered and I vaguely got a clue. In that case, I couldn't exchange this vase with him easily. But if I don't exchange it, first of all, I am not knowledgeable enough to know the true value of this bottle. Second, Zhao Hao is indeed a big problem. This time, Officer Wang specially invited me to the Wang family because of the competition at the Heavenly Grand Ritual. I must represent the Wang family and fight with Zhao Hao. Although I have many trump cards, I don't dare to say that I can defeat Zhao Hao. At this time, if I can obtain a powerful magical artifact, it will be very beneficial for me. I hesitated again. After thinking for a while, I made up my mind. For the time being, I wouldn't consider whether I should exchange it or not. I needed to go to Song Feng's place and find out the true value of this yin and yang rui vase. Then, I would make a decision. Chapter 574. After making up my mind, I didn't wait any longer and directly headed towards the mysterious treasure paradise. At that moment, Song Feng and Huang Fuxiu were leading their subordinates out. The mysterious treasure paradise was really unlucky. It was one of the 36 minor paradises, but only Huang Fuxiu, a young god celestial master, was there to support them. In the banquet hall, the people from the other paradises were at least at the celestial master realm. Only the followers from the mysterious treasure paradise were still at the celestial master realm. Their situation was similar to Wangu paradise. The difference was that Wangu paradise had Wang Can, who had great potential. Moreover, there were many celestial masters among the servants. Overall, Wangu Grotto Heaven was much stronger. This was probably the difference in power between the 10 major paradises and the 36 minor paradises. Huang Fuxiu frowned when he saw that I was following him. He turned around and blocked my path with his mountain-like body. "What's the matter?" he asked coldly with a dignified expression. I naturally wouldn't be scared by his expression. I shook my head. "Move aside. I'm not here to look for you." When Huang Fuxiu heard what I said, he arched his eyebrows. Just as he was about to say something, Song Feng's young and aged voice came from behind him. "Xiu, let him come over." Huang Fuxiu's face visibly trembled when he heard that. He turned around and looked at Song Feng with resentment. However, he didn't dare to say anything and moved to the side unwillingly. I felt weird when I heard that. Huang Fuxiu was such a big guy. His name was feminine enough, but Song Feng still called him that. It was more than awkward. I didn't pay attention to Huang Fuxiu and walked towards Song Feng. Since he was standing, Song Feng's childlike body was even more obvious. He only reached my waist. Such a child had his eyes squinted and his hands clasped behind his back. However, due to his height, he could only lift his head to look at me. The scene was indescribably comical. You've thought it through? Song Feng raised his head and looked at me before asking slowly. I've thought it through. I nodded and said, however, I still have some questions to ask you. Can I have a word with you? Upon hearing my words, Huang Fu Xiu lifted her head and frowned at me. She seemed to want to stop me. But before he could speak, Song Feng coughed lightly, waved his hand and instructed, You guys wait here, I'll be back soon. After all, Song Feng was a senior. Since he had already spoken, Huang Fu Xiu did not dare to say anything else. She could only bow and accept the order. With that, Song Feng slowly walked out with his hands behind his back. I followed him out. At this moment, the sky was completely dark. However, the main hall and the surrounding stairs were still brightly lit. Countless lanterns illuminated the place as if it was daytime. Song Feng walked all the way down the stairs and stopped in the shadows. He didn't seem to be in a hurry to ask about the seed. With his hands behind his back, he looked up at the sky and said calmly, The stars in the sky are bright. It's rare to see such a clear day in the middle of the moon. I followed his gaze and looked up. The sky was indeed filled with bright stars. I wasn't sure if it was because the air was better than the outside world or if there were other reasons, but the sky was densely packed with stars. There were far more of them than what the outside world could see. At a glance, it didn't look like the real world, but more like a galaxy map. After looking at the stars, just as I was about to retract my gaze, I suddenly realized that something was wrong. Song Feng said that today was the middle of the moon. I purposely recalled that today was indeed the 15th of the 5th month. However, in this clear night there were many stars in the sky, but there was no trace of the moon. What was going on? I looked at the sky in shock, my expression filled with disbelief. Song Feng turned around and saw my expression. He revealed a playful expression and asked, Is this your first time in the blessed heavenly abode? Although I didn't know why he asked that, I subconsciously nodded. Song Feng revealed an expression that showed he was used to this. He pointed at the sky and said calmly, All the blessed heavenly abode are like this. You can only see the stars, but not the moon. It's completely different from the outside world. To be honest, I've lived for more than 200 years, but I still haven't figured out where the blessed heavenly abode is located. I didn't quite understand what he was saying, so I subconsciously asked, Aren't they hidden among the famous mountains and rivers? Aren't they on the ground? Song Feng shook his head. Rumor has it that the blessed heavenly abode doesn't belong to the human world. It's the ancestors of the various families who used supreme Taoist techniques to connect the blessed heavenly abode with the famous mountains and rivers. After thousands of years of inheritance, the Taoist techniques have withered, and the truth has been buried in history. I was startled, but I had some doubts in my heart. It wasn't that I didn't believe in such supreme Taoist techniques, but Wang Can had previously told me that the Wangwu heavenly abode was a secluded place created by the Wang family's ancestors after they gathered the 4 true dragon veins. This was already a big deal, but it was much more practical than Song Feng's saying that the blessed heavenly abode didn't belong to the human world. However, this saying couldn't explain why there were stars in the sky but no moon. I didn't question it, and Song Feng didn't sigh. After a moment of silence, he finally asked about the important matter. All right, let's not talk nonsense. Kid, let me ask you, do you remember where you got the seed? Of course. I nodded, but I didn't answer him directly. Instead, I said, However, I have a question I want to know. A question? Song Feng turned around and raised his head to look at me. There was a hint of playfulness in his eyes. Being too curious isn't necessarily a good thing. What is it? Tell me. He seemed to be warning me about something, but I already had a plan in mind. After hesitating for a moment, I said, I won't hide it from Senior. I got this seed from an old vase. I want to know the origin of that vase, and what is the use of it for senior. When Song Feng heard me say the word vase, his eyes shrank. However, his expression quickly returned to normal. He replied, "Don't worry. The seed and the vase aren't rare treasures. They won't be of any help to your cultivation. As for the use, when I was young, I had an old friend who was related to this vase. I just couldn't let go of the past, so I wanted to get the vase to remember him." He didn't make himself clear, but I still got two useful pieces of information. First, he knew the relationship between the seed and the yin and yang rui vase. Second, his purpose wasn't just the seed. He asked me about the seed's origin, but his target was the vase. The more he tried to hide it, the more curious I became. It also proved that the vase was extraordinary. I originally wanted to tell him about the vase, but I changed my mind. After thinking for a while, I said, "I got this seed in Hong Kong. I saw it with my own eyes. The seed was taken out of a vase with a painting of an ancient tree." This was the excuse I had thought of. The reason I used Hong Kong as an excuse was that it was far from the mainland. It wouldn't be easy for Song Feng to verify it. Hearing my words, Song Feng's eyes focused. His breathing quickened as he asked, "Do you know who that person was?" I nodded and smirked. "The Grand Elder of the Ghost Nurturing Sect in Hong Kong, Liang Tianxin." Liang Tianxin, that old man, had caused me so much trouble. Now that he was missing in Chio's tomb, he was the perfect scapegoat. If Song Feng went to Hong Kong to search for Liang Tianxin, he definitely wouldn't be able to find him. However, his disciples and grand disciples of the Ghost Nurturing Sect would suffer. Of course, I wasn't trying to deceive Song Feng. Firstly, I hadn't seen the magic tool he promised me, so I couldn't judge its value. Secondly, since the vase wasn't ordinary, I had to at least study it carefully before making a decision. If the magic tool he promised me was really extraordinary and the vase was really useless to me, then after the heavenly grand ritual, I would return to Hong Kong and secretly place the yin-yang rui vase in the Ghost Nurturing Sect's headquarters. Song Feng clearly believed my words, but he still asked, "Are you telling the truth?" I nodded. "Of course. You should understand that if I can give you a magic tool that can contend against Zhao Hao, then I can also easily erase you from this world," Song Feng indifferently warned me. Then, he extended his hand. "All right, now give me that seed. I'll give you the magic tool." After receiving the seed, Song Feng's expression seemed to be a bit sad. After staring at it for a few seconds, he finally revealed a relieved expression. Then, he put it in his sleeve. After doing all this, he suddenly looked up at me and asked, "Boy, do you know how to use a sword?" The sword was the most powerful weapon. Whether it was a martial artist in the secular world or a cultivator in the metaphysical world, who didn't know how to use a sword? Although I wasn't as good as a sword cultivator like Imo, I had used a sword many times on the path of cultivation. Even now, I still had the Xian Yuan sword. I nodded. "I'm not proficient, but I can use it." Song Feng nodded and didn't say anything else. Then, he stretched out his small hand and drew a circle in the air. Then, I felt an abundant whirlpool of Dao Qi gathering in the direction of his finger. Didn't Officer Wang say that this little old man had lost his cultivation? How could he still mobilize Dao Qi at this moment? It seemed that Officer Wang didn't know much about his background. After a while, the Dao Qi at the place where Song Feng was pointing had become solid. Seeing that it was about time, he stopped and shouted, "Open!" Along with his voice, there seemed to be a ripple on both sides of the condensed Dao Qi, revealing a black hole. Then, a long sword with a broken section slowly floated out from within. "This sword is for you. You must treat it well and don't let it down." Song Feng's eyes seemed to be filled with nostalgia. He flicked his hand and the broken sword flew towards me. I reached out to catch it and subconsciously asked, "What's the name of this sword?" Song Feng had already turned around and was walking away. Hearing my question, he didn't immediately answer. After he was far away, a voice came from the twilight. It seemed to be a sigh. Chapter 575. Armor Stripping? When I heard this name, I was surprised. Isn't this the sword that Song Feng's twin brother used? Back then, the two brothers could rely on their power to defeat the Yang God's Celestial Master when they were still at the Celestial Master realm. No wonder Song Feng dared to promise me that he could fight with Zhao Hao with this magical artifact. However, I didn't understand why he would give me such a precious item so casually. Just a moment ago, I was still suspicious of his motives, so I deliberately concealed the information about the yin and yang rui vase. Who would have thought that he would be so generous? I felt ashamed. After thinking for a while, I wanted to tell him the truth about the yin and yang rui vase. However, I had lied, so I had to go back to Hong Kong to make up for it. Song Feng wouldn't leave the heavenly grand ritual, so I would go back and send the yin and yang rui vase to the ghost-raising sect as soon as possible. After thinking about it, I didn't hesitate anymore. I picked up the armor-stripping sword and looked at it. With just a glance, I frowned slightly. Not only was the sword broken, but it was also covered in rust. It didn't look good at all. Moreover, the rust wasn't only on the surface. The deepest part of the sword was completely rotten. It looked like it could be broken into two pieces with a little force. Moreover, there were many marks left by axes and knives. At first glance, I could tell that it had gone through a lot of vicissitude. Of course, this sword was a Taoist sword, not an ordinary weapon. When it was used to fight, it didn't need to hack or slash. Its real power didn't have much to do with its appearance. But then again, ritual implements usually had a restrained Taoist rhyme. If one paid attention to Taoist qi, they would form a unique halo, making the ritual implement look extraordinary. This sword was truly unusual. Either it had something special about it, or it had experienced some strange things. While thinking, I looked at the hilt. On one side of the hilt, there were two big characters engraved. It was armor stripping. Song Feng had said that these two swords were created when the Kunlun Mountain's earth dragon split the earth. Apparently, they weren't named by someone else. The sword itself was engraved with the name. Besides the words armor stripping, there was another line of small characters engraved on the other side of the hilt. The one who holds this sword should extinguish his lust. I'll slay all monsters with my sword. This line of small characters was different from the two words on the other side, strip armor. The two words were written in seal script, simple and unadorned, without any trace of carving. They had long been integrated with the sword hilt, as if they were naturally there. As for this line of small words, it was just an ordinary semi-cursive script. One could clearly see traces of carving. Although these traces were not considered new, compared to the two words remove armor, it was obvious that they were carved later. Could it be that it was carved by the Hidden Edge? If it was him, why would he carve such a line of words? Did he have a grudge against monsters? I didn't understand, but I didn't put it to heart. In the Taoist scripture of tranquility, it was said that Laozi had once said, "The great Tao is merciless. It moves the sun and moon." Therefore, in the world of metaphysics, there were many interpretations of the great Tao being emotionless. Many people understood it to mean that in order to pursue the great Tao, one had to be emotionless. But in my opinion, it was absurd. That sentence in the Tao scripture was meant to explain the true meaning of the word Tao. Before and after this sentence, there were two more sentences. The first one was, "The great Tao is invisible, but it gives birth to heaven and earth." The second one was, "The great Tao is nameless, but it nourishes all things." After the three sentences, the Tao scripture concluded, "I don't know its name, but I call it Tao." This was the Taoists' explanation of the origin of all things in the world and the nature of all things. The Taoists believed that Tao was the origin of the universe, the origin of heaven and earth, the root of all things, and the cardinal mechanism of creation. It was invisible, colorless, odorless, and omnipresent. It filled the universe and covered all directions. It didn't increase or decrease, and it existed eternally. It was invisible and nameless, but it truly existed. Therefore, the two words, emotionless, didn't mean to extinguish emotions and lust. It just meant that the great Tao wasn't human, and it didn't have joy or sorrow. Of course, if one understood it as a cultivator who wanted to cultivate to the extreme and even become the Tao, they had to reach the inhuman realm of supreme oblivion. This saying of extinguishing emotions and lust seemed to make some sense. However, whether it was by the snake spirit, Tong Tong, Fatty, or Wang Li, I had a long-lasting friendship with them. No matter what, I couldn't reach this realm. If the end of the great Tao was bound to be like this, I was afraid it would be difficult for me to pursue the great Tao. However, I was just a heavenly seal master, and I still had a long way to go on the great Tao. It was too early to talk about the end of the great Tao. While I was thinking, I heard noises from the entrance of the hall behind me. I turned around and saw the people from the blessed enclave coming out one after another. Apparently, the banquet tonight was over. I waited for a while. After all the people from the blessed enclave had left, Officer Wang also came out. When I saw him, I walked over and greeted him. Officer Wang heaved a sigh of relief when he saw me. He said, "Sage, I couldn't find you anywhere. I thought something had happened." I smiled and shook my head. I raised the broken sword in my hand and said, "Senior Tsang Feng summoned me and gave me a sword. By the way, do you know how to use the armor-stripping sword?" After hearing my words, Officer Wang's face froze. After a long time, he was dumbfounded. What did you say? Tsang Feng, that old monster, gave you the armor-stripping sword?" After getting my confirmation, Officer Wang looked at me with an odd face. After a long time, he forced a smile and said, "It seems the sage is blessed by the heavens. Tsang Feng, that old monster, might be able to sense the way of heaven. That's why he gave you the sword." I shook my head. "There's no such thing as the way of heaven. Do you remember the vase I just asked you about? He gave me the sword to exchange for the vase." Officer Wang found it unbelievable. "Is that vase a treasure that I don't know about? Even if it's a treasure, it can't be compared to the armor-stripping sword. How could it be?" He was right. Although the Yin and Yang Rui vase was of the highest quality, it wasn't as good as the armor-stripping sword, a peerless magical weapon that was nurtured by the heavens and the earth. Tsang Feng's action was really confusing. After pondering for a while, I could only think of one explanation. He had given me the sword not only because of the vase, but also because of something else. It was highly possible that it had something to do with my identity as a sage or my previous life. I asked Officer Wang if he knew how to use the sword. However, Officer Wang shook his head. "This sword is just a legend in the Blessed Enclave. I've only heard of its name. However, we could figure out the function of a magical weapon on our own. Since Tsang Feng didn't mention anything about it when he gave me the sword, I guessed that there was no secret method to use it. I could try to use it later." I couldn't get any useful information from Officer Wang. After saying goodbye to him, I took the armor-stripping sword and returned to the place where I was staying. It was the small Taoist palace where the ancestors of the Wang family cultivated. When I returned, the fatty was still sleeping. Moreover, I didn't wake him up when I entered the room. This guy wasn't vigilant at all. He didn't look like a cultivator at all. However, I was quite envious of him. His path of cultivation was stable, and he hadn't experienced many dangerous situations. He wasn't like me. I didn't even know when was the last time I had a good night's sleep. Since he was sleeping soundly, I didn't wake him up. Instead, I sat cross-legged next to the bed. I condensed a wisp of Tao energy in my hand and slowly injected it into the armor-stripping sword. I was ready to test its power. Unexpectedly, the armor-stripping sword didn't react at all. It was like a clay ox entering the sea. I frowned. After thinking for a while, I guessed that it was because I had injected too little Tao energy. This armor-stripping sword wasn't an ordinary item. I guessed that it had a requirement for one's cultivation to use it. So, I mobilized more Tao energy and infused it into the sword. This time, the armor-stripping sword reacted quickly. As soon as the Tao energy was infused, a layer of dark yellow light appeared on the blade. This light was very faint, but after it appeared, it scattered to the side. After it left the sword, it didn't wait for me to react. It quickly turned into a starlight and shot out. At this moment, I was sitting cross-legged on the wooden chair made of serene wood. With a crisp sound, the yellow starlight directly smashed the wooden chair into pieces. Serene wood wasn't an ordinary item. It contained extreme yin and extreme yang energies. It was the most sturdy wood. It was known as the wood that wouldn't rot even after 10,000 years. With my current cultivation, it would take me a lot of effort to break it. However, this armor-stripping sword, which I had only casually tried, directly smashed the serene wood chair. Chapter 576. While I was still shocked by the power of the dismantling armor sword, the fat man on the bed was startled awake by the sound of the serene wood chair shattering. He suddenly jumped up and looked around in a daze. Finally, he stared at me, who was sitting on the edge of the bed. He asked with a confused expression, "Third baby, what's that sound? Is there thunder outside?" This fellow. I smiled wryly and shook my head. I pointed at the broken wood on the floor and joked, "Yes, not only is there thunder, but it's also about to strike you. I used this chair to block it." "What?" The fat man didn't react. After being stunned for a while, he curled his lips and said, "If there's thunder, it'll strike you first. You're a heaven-defying four-word celestial master. You'll be punished by the heavens. What's with this chair? Did you break it?" I waved the dismantling armor sword in my hand. "Someone gave me a magic tool today. I wanted to test its power, but I couldn't control it. It's a pity for this serene wood chair." "Magic tool?" The fat man looked at the broken sword in my hand and sneered. "This thing is a magic tool? Third baby, are you sure you haven't been tricked?" The dismantling armor sword's appearance was really bad. I shook my head and didn't explain to the fat man. I only said to him, "Release your cultivation and set up a barrier in front of you. I'll test the power of this sword." Breaking the serene wood chair proved that the dismantling armor sword's power was extraordinary. However, the serene wood chair was just an inanimate object. Previously, I had only heard that it was very sturdy. In reality, I didn't know how much power was needed to break it. I knew the fat man's cultivation. If I let him test it for me, I would have a deeper understanding of the dismantling armor sword's power. The fat man hesitated and said, "You're a celestial master. With my cultivation, if you don't control it well, you'll destroy me as well." This fellow was just too talkative. I glared at him. "Stop talking nonsense. I'll naturally control my power. Quickly set up a barrier. Make it as thick as possible." The fat man then shut his mouth and stepped forward. A circular Tao Qi barrier that looked like a flower petal surrounded his body. Looking at the barrier in front of me, I silently activated my Taoist Qi and infused it into the dismantling armor sword. Soon, the blade of the sword glowed with a dark yellow light. This time, I carefully controlled the yellow light so that only a few wisps of it scattered and coiled around the fatty's protective barrier, spinning in circles. The fatty didn't think that the yellow light was a threat. He laughed and said, "The power of this magical tool is too weak." I didn't have time to care about him. I took a deep breath and continued to control the yellow light, gathering it on the fatty's protective barrier. In the beginning, I only used the power of the dragon-seeking realm. Gradually, I increased my power to the acupoint sealing realm. The fatty's protective barrier didn't show any signs of movement. When I increased my power to the acupoint sealing realm, the yellow light surrounding the fatty's protective barrier instantly became sharp, as though the shadows of swords were intersecting. Following a crisp sound, countless cracks suddenly appeared on the fatty's protective barrier, and it directly collapsed. The fatty's current cultivation was already at the glory of knowledge completion. I was prepared to increase my power to the initial stage of glory of knowledge cultivation to test its power. But out of caution, I increased my power bit by bit. Who knew that just using the advanced stage of acupoint sealing realm was enough to break through his protective barrier? Luckily, I didn't use the initial stage of glory of knowledge cultivation. Otherwise, I would have hurt the fatty. Seeing the barrier shatter, the fatty was shocked. After focusing his senses for a moment, his expression changed and he exclaimed, "You only used the acupoint sealing realm to activate it?" I nodded and exhaled. Activating the acupoint sealing realm could break through the protective barrier of glory of knowledge completion. The power of the dismantling armor sword seemed to be more terrifying than I had imagined. Seeing that I had confirmed it, the fatty's face was filled with disbelief. "That's impossible, right? Is it that the sword counters the Taoist Qi barrier? Or is it especially suitable for cultivators with low cultivation? Why don't I set up a formation for you to try?" I was stunned. I hadn't thought of that idea just now. I asked him, "What formation?" Speaking of formations, the fatty's expression brightened up. He said proudly, "I set up a formation that the Yang God Celestial Master can't break through in an instant. Moreover, it's different from the Taoist Qi barrier. My formation's aura is mixed. Even if it specifically counters Taoist Qi, it's useless. If you can break through it this time, I'll really be convinced." Hearing what he said, I was slightly shocked. In the past, I knew that the fatty's cultivation in formations wasn't ordinary. However, I didn't expect that he could actually set up a battle technique that even the Yang God Celestial Master couldn't break through in an instant. After I agreed, the fatty quickly took out the items that he used to set up formations. Very quickly, he set up a careful defensive formation in the house. The formation was in the shape of a hexagram. It emitted a white jade light, revealing an aura that only the Yang God Celestial Master had. I didn't even need to test it. I could tell that the formation was purely for defense. It indeed had the power of a Yang God Celestial Master. I activated the dismantling armor sword once again. This time, I didn't suppress the cultivation in my body. I channeled all of my qi and true essence into the sword. In an instant, the dismantling armor sword shone brightly. This time, the yellow starlight didn't directly disperse. Instead, it gathered together and transformed into a sword silhouette. Under my control, it charged towards the jade-white protective formation. The speed of the sword's shadow was extremely fast. Just as it left the armor remover sword, it arrived in front of the fatty's defensive formation in the next second and stabbed towards it. Like a hot knife cutting through butter, the dark yellow sword's shadow wasn't obstructed at all. It directly split the defensive formation in half from the middle. Even after it pierced through, the formation maintained itself for a few seconds before instantly collapsing and dissipating. The fatty's eyes widened again. This time, he couldn't say anything. I was dumbfounded. The armor remover sword wasn't as the fatty had said. It wasn't suitable for cultivators with low cultivation. Instead, as the user's cultivation increased, its power increased to a terrifying level. A Yang God Celestial Master's defensive formation was instantly broken. This was under the situation where I only used Taoist Qi. If I used Shaman Qi, its power would multiply. I couldn't help but get excited. The armor remover sword definitely lived up to its reputation. With it and the Xianyuan sword, I might even be able to kill a normal Yang God Celestial Master, let alone a Seal Celestial Master Zhao Hao. Of course, using the armor remover sword took a lot of effort. When I tested it just now, I could feel that I had to spend a lot of effort to control every trace of yellow starlight that was released from the blade. Just now, when the yellow sword shadow was formed, I used up a lot of time. When I was in a real battle, I wouldn't have the time to slowly activate it. It seemed that I would have to practice more in the future. Furthermore, I have a faint feeling that with my current level of cultivation, I am still unable to fully display the might of this armor-stripping sword. Once my level of cultivation increases in the future, this armor-stripping sword will probably give me an even greater surprise. After testing the sword, even though I was pleasantly surprised, my body was still tired. I put away the armor remover sword and went to sleep. Even though the fatty had slept for half a day, he was the type of person who would fall asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. He wasn't worried that he would wake me up if he didn't sleep. The night passed uneventfully. When I woke up the next day, it was already noon. I got up and stretched my body. Then, I sat cross-legged on the bed and circulated my Taoist qi. After completing a complete cycle, I opened my eyes and spat out a mouthful of murky qi. After becoming a celestial master, I could clearly feel that the Taoist qi in my body was becoming thicker and more condensed. As I cultivated, it was improving every day. My shaman qi had improved quite a bit in the beginning. However, it gradually stopped moving and my cultivation stopped improving. I understood that there were many true dragon veins in the world. The spiritual energy that they emitted could be absorbed by cultivators at any time to increase their cultivation. However, the shaman qi was different. When I was in the corpse sect, the Tai Sui had imbued me with his shaman qi. Up until now, I had only been absorbing the shaman qi that had accumulated in my body. The reason why I had stopped improving was that the shaman qi in my body had been completely absorbed. Even though there was shaman qi in Wanwu Grotto Heaven that could be absorbed for cultivation, I wasn't a person of Wanwu Grotto Heaven and would have to leave sooner or later. Moreover, with my current strength, I couldn't temporarily store the shaman qi in my body like the Tai Sui from the corpse sect and absorb it later. Therefore, relying on the shaman qi here wasn't a long-term plan. If I wanted to improve my shaman qi, I would have to find the Tai Sui again. Ever since Xiao Jin disappeared, there hadn't been any news about him. The Tai Sui from the corpse sect had also disappeared from the world. Now, I only knew about the Tai Sui in Thailand's Heavenly Dragon Temple that the black-cloved Azan had told me about. Perhaps he would have to find some time to go to Thailand. As I thought about it, I got out of the bed. After I put on my clothes and washed up, I temporarily put this matter aside and walked to the table. I took the Yin Yang Rui vase and carefully examined it. Regardless of whether that old man Tsang Feng had other intentions, on the surface, he had only given me the armor-removing sword because of this vase. Chapter 577. The Yin and Yang Rui bottle was a Taoist magic tool that only a heavenly master could control. The bottle had a Taoist charm, which made the ancient trees look extraordinary. However, after looking at it for a long time, I couldn't find anything except for the fact that the trees looked more and more real. I sighed and pondered a little. Since I couldn't find anything strange about the Yin and Yang bottle, I could only bring it to Hong Kong and give it to Tsang Feng. After all, the armor-stripping sword he gave me was of great value. Of course, if I could find the secret of the Yin and Yang bottle while staying in Wanwu Grotto Heaven, it wouldn't be too late for me to think about it. After making up my mind, I put the bottle down. However, when I was about to turn around, I saw a faint red light flash on the bottle. At the same time, I had a vague feeling that I was being watched. Although the human eye was the main organ that could capture information, it could sometimes get the wrong information due to the change in color. That was why I didn't care about the faint red light I saw. However, I couldn't help but pay more attention to the feeling of being watched. There was a sixth sense in biology and psychology. Cultivators had sharp spiritual senses, and their sixth sense was much better than that of ordinary people. As long as I had a feeling, it couldn't be an illusion. Therefore, the feeling of being spied on just now was definitely real. Could it be that the yin and yang bottle could store living things? Could it be that there was a living thing inside? But if that was the case, it couldn't be right. According to my previous speculation, the reason Song Feng asked for the yin-yang bottle was to store his own soul in it so that he could continue living. However, if there was already a living creature in the yin-yang bottle, wouldn't it lose its meaning to him? I picked up the bottle and observed it again. However, no matter how hard I looked, I couldn't find anything strange. The feeling of being watched had also disappeared. It was as if it had never happened. Feeling helpless, I had to give up exploring and sat down cross-legged. I placed the armor-stripping sword in front of me and began to familiarize myself with how to control it. According to Officer Wang, the Heavenly Grand Ritual would start tomorrow. Although the All-Heaven competition would last for 2 days, there were only 3 or 4 days left. There wasn't much time left. I had to quickly familiarize myself with the armor-stripping sword. That way I would be more confident. The All-Heaven competition determined the ranking of the blessed grotto heavens, so it was very important to them. However, according to the rules of the ancestors, only those who had reached the Celestial Master stage could participate. Although there were many young god celestial masters in the blessed enclave, and there were even many people with higher realms, some of the small blessed enclave's forces were weak, and there were only cultivators at the level of celestial master. Secondly, when the young god celestial master made a move, the power was too great. Once the true fire was unleashed, it would be difficult to control. Thus, it was best to send the Heavenly Master Seal into battle while others with higher cultivation watched from the sidelines. If there were any unforeseen circumstances, they would be able to intervene and resolve the situation. This is also the reason why Officer Wang invited me to participate in the All-Heaven competition. Otherwise, be it Fu, Shou, or the others, their cultivation levels are much higher than mine. Such an important battle would not have been my turn. Although my cultivation level is only at the early stage of Celestial Master Seal, with my forward seal and many other methods, I'm confident in dealing with some Celestial Master Seal in the mortal world. However, the Blessed Enclave is different. Any Blessed Enclave or Blessed Enclave's inheritance is calculated in thousands of years. In the thousands of years of inheritance, the paths, techniques, and divine abilities are far superior to those of the same cultivation level. However, I have no confidence in dealing with the Celestial Master Seal here. I can only place my hopes on the armor-stripping sword before me. Only by completely mastering its control will I be able to help the Wanwu Grotto Heaven in the All-Heaven competition. Furthermore, there's also Zhao Hao, who's obviously targeting me. He's from the Xuanda Grotto Heaven and has suppressed his cultivation level to the peak of Celestial Master Seal. He's also a sword cultivator, so his strength is probably not inferior to Lu Zhenyang's. Thus, the sense of crisis in my heart became even stronger, and I couldn't be bothered to study the vase. The most difficult part of controlling the armor-stripping sword is controlling the faint yellow light that appears after I infuse it with my Dao Qi. Each of these light rays is a scattered strand of sword Qi. Although they're incomparably sharp, they don't have much power when they're scattered. To use them against an enemy, I have to quickly control all of them and fuse them into one, causing their power to explode at the same time. When fighting against an enemy, victory or defeat can be decided in an instant. The stronger the enemy, the less time I have to attack. Thus, I'm currently training my speed, using the fastest speed to gather the faint yellow sword Qi. Just now, when the fatty used the formation to test the sword, I gathered all of the sword Qi released by the armor-stripping sword into a sword shadow. It took me about 10 seconds. For me, who's using the armor-stripping sword for the first time, this is already a good result. However, it's far from enough to fight against an enemy. Not to mention 10 seconds, with Zhao Hao's strength, I only need to delay for a second, or even half a second, and the result will be a crushing defeat. Thus, in the next 3 days, I have to continuously train and try my best to control the sword light in an instant. Even if I can't control it in an instant, I have to control the time within half a second. I kept channeling my Tao Qi and true essence into the dismantling armor sword. Again and again, I tried to quickly control the sword light. As I became more and more proficient, I gradually reduced the time from the initial 10 seconds to 8 seconds, then 6 seconds. After a whole day had passed, I could already control the time to within 5 seconds. At this time, the Tao Qi in my body had already dried up, and I couldn't continue training. Thus, I finally stopped and prepared to replenish my Tao Qi and cultivate for a while before continuing. Because the Tao Qi in the Taoist palace that Ancestor Officer Wang cultivated had all turned into shaman Qi, if I wanted to quickly replenish my Tao Qi, I could only go to the lake formed by the 4 true dragon veins outside. Thus, after I opened my eyes, I prepared to get up and go out. However, as soon as I got up, I suddenly had a strong feeling that I was being watched. I abruptly turned my head and looked behind me. The yin-yang rui vase that I had placed on the table had mysteriously appeared on the ground behind me. Immediately, I felt a chill run down my spine. You should know that after I put down the yin-yang rui vase, I stayed here. Even though my mind was focused on controlling the armor-removing sword, with my cultivation, my spiritual sense should be able to cover a radius of several dozen meters around me. Logically speaking, within this distance, not even the slightest movement in the surroundings should be able to escape my senses. But this strange vase, without my knowledge, ran from the table to the ground. How is this possible? Moreover, the feeling of being watched was even clearer than before. If I had been hesitant before, then now, I was certain that the thing stored in the vase had its own consciousness. Just like the last time, after I noticed it, the feeling of being watched disappeared. I picked up the vase again to observe it, but I still didn't find anything. Even when I opened the lid, there was nothing inside. There was no movement at all. I put the vase down and couldn't help but continue thinking. This bottle was originally in this Taoist palace, but when I studied it yesterday, I didn't find anything out of the ordinary. Even when I took it out for Fatty to demonstrate and took out a spherical seed from it, there was no reaction at all. Yet today it had already spied on me twice. It even moved on its own. From its trajectory, it seemed to want to get closer to my body. What was the reason for this? After thinking about it carefully, I quickly realized that the only difference between yesterday and today was that I had brought back the armor-stripping sword. Could it be that this vase had some sort of connection with the armor-stripping sword? The reason why Tsang Feng was so anxious to obtain this vase wasn't what I thought it was, but because there was some sort of connection between this vase and the armor-stripping sword? If that was the case, then it made sense for Tsang Feng to give me the armor-stripping sword. Perhaps he didn't believe my nonsense and guessed that I could come into contact with the vase, so he purposely gave me the armor-stripping sword so that the vase could come into contact with the armor-stripping sword. With that thought, my hair stood on end. I quickly put the armor-stripping sword back into Xiang Lu's leather pouch. Following the disappearance of the armor-stripping sword, I didn't know if it was an illusion, but I faintly felt a sigh coming from the yin-yang rui vase. Immediately after, it seemed that the mysterious existence in the vase had disappeared. I heaved a sigh of relief. At the same time, I made up my mind that regardless of whether my guess was correct or not, I definitely couldn't let the armor-stripping sword appear in front of the vase again. Due to the depletion of the Tao Qi in my body, I placed the yin-yang rui vase back on the table and walked out of the palace. I sat cross-legged beside the lake formed by the 4 true dragon veins' spiritual energy. I quickly absorbed and replenished my energy. Not long after, the Tao Qi in my body was once again abundant. After replenishing my Tao Qi, I didn't dare to return to the palace. I raised my eyes and looked around. I noticed that there was a mountain peak in the distance that had a pleasant scenery. Thus, I took a step and flew towards the mountain peak. After I landed, I was in the middle of a forest. I closed my eyes and sensed the surroundings. The spiritual energy in the surroundings was still abundant and the Tao Qi was circulating very quickly. Thus, I sat cross-legged and prepared to continue practicing my control of the armor-stripping sword. However, before I could pour my Tao Qi into the sword, I suddenly felt that something was wrong. I didn't know when, but in the surrounding forest, there were several cold and sharp auras. These auras were firmly locked onto my body. Chapter 578. I was alarmed and slowly withdrew the Taoist Qi and genuine essence that I had injected into the dismantling armor sword. At the same time, I quietly took out the sound-transmitting talisman that Wang Qin had given me and tried to contact him. My cultivation wasn't weak, but the auras of the people lurking around scared me. I could even clearly feel the auras of the Yang God's celestial master, and there were more than one of them. No matter how confident I was, I didn't dare to be careless. I immediately sent a message to Wang Qin. However, after sending the message, I was stunned. The working principle of the sound-transmitting talisman was that the genuine essence that contained one's thoughts would be transmitted to another talisman through the formation on the talisman. When Wang Qin had given me this talisman, I had tried it. My thoughts and genuine essence had turned into a light spot that circled around the talisman. Then, it had integrated into the formation. Wang Qin should have received the message. However, when I had sent my thoughts and genuine essence into the talisman, the small light spot had been circling around the talisman. It seemed that something had blocked it, and it couldn't integrate into the formation. While I was feeling anxious, a gentle voice came from behind me. Don't waste your time. I've sent people to block the surrounding area with a secret technique. It's impossible for Wang Qin to receive the message. When I heard the voice, I turned my head and saw Zhao Hao appear from the forest not far away. The cold and sharp aura on his body was one of the auras of the experts I had sensed earlier. Behind him, there were two people dressed in coarse gray clothing. Their faces were sallow and they were emaciated. Their eyes were murky and lifeless. They looked like refugees who had escaped from a disaster. However, they each held a sword box in their arms. The sword box had a cold glow on it. I could feel the cold, killing intent from it even from afar. The aura of the Yang God's celestial master that I had sensed earlier had come from them. Judging from their appearance, I was afraid that they were the so-called sword slaves of the Xuanda Wonderland. A Seal celestial master at the exceptional realm, and two Yang God celestial masters as sword slaves. Even if I could master the dismantling armor sword, I would still be no match for them. After Zhao Hao publicly threatened me at the banquet yesterday, I originally thought that he would leave the enmity in the arena, yet I never imagined that he would actually be so impatient and want to make a move against me at this moment. I coldly looked at Zhao Hao and forced myself to calm down. This is Wanwu Paradise. Even if you set up a secret seal, how long can you hide it? Moreover, Wang Qin has always been on guard against you. Once he discovers that my aura has disappeared, he will immediately come looking for you. Zhao Hao looked at me with pity. He wasn't as overbearing as he was yesterday. Instead, he was teasing me like a cat catching a mouse. So what if it's Wanwu Paradise? When the Wang family's old man was here, everyone respected them as the first paradise, but now, Wang Qin has just advanced to the heavenly master rank and only relies on a few Yang God old slaves to keep up appearances. Who would take Wanwu Paradise seriously? My heart sank. Zhao Hao was right. The heavenly grand ritual was about to arrive. All the blessed paradises didn't want to complicate matters at this time. Zhao Hao's action had actually violated the tacit understanding. But at the same time, the decline of Wanwu Paradise was an indisputable fact. The other paradises would probably be happy to have everyone kick them when they are down. Even if he killed me now, the other blessed paradises wouldn't say anything. As for Wang Can, it was still uncertain whether he could survive the all-heaven competition. What could he do to Zhao Hao? Moreover, Zhao Hao had brought 2 young god celestial masters with him. If Wang Can felt that something was wrong and rushed over, even if he brought Fu, it was hard to say whether he could save me or not. Even so, I was unwilling to give up and said in a low voice, Wanwu Paradise is protected by a formation. As long as he rushes over and mobilizes the power of the formation, it won't be a problem to deal with you. Wang Can said that Wanwu Grotto Heaven was guarded by a tactical formation, but he didn't tell me the details. However, in the past 2 days, the fat man had nothing to do here. He studied the tactical formation here and speculated that the tactical formation of Wanwu Grotto Heaven was extraordinary. Even the 4 true dragon veins were part of the tactical formation. Not only did they hide the mountain gate, but they also had the effect of defending against enemies. As long as one was in the tactical formation, Wanwu Grotto Heaven could control the tactical formation to defend against enemies. Although it was just the fatty's speculation and hadn't been confirmed, I could only use it to deter Zhao Hao in this desperate situation. After Zhao Hao heard what I said, a trace of haze flashed across his face and his voice became cold. Of course I know there's a formation. If it weren't for this formation, we would have already killed our way here and taken this paradise. Why would we need to wait for the heavenly grand ritual? It was obvious that he had no other choice. After saying that, he glanced at me and said coldly, "But don't worry. I'll kill you before Wang Can arrives." Although Wanwu Paradise is strong, Wang Can won't dare to offend all the blessed paradises. What can he do then? The fact that Wanwu Paradise had a formation to defend against enemies was beyond my expectation. However, even with the formation, Zhao Hao still had the upper hand. As he had said, if he killed me, Wang Can wouldn't dare to do anything after he arrived. If he dared to touch Zhao Hao, the other blessed paradises wouldn't agree. After all, everyone was gathered here. No one wanted to see Wanwu Paradise use the power of the formation to deal with the other paradises. There was only one way to survive, which was to hold on until Wang Can arrived. I took a deep breath and didn't say anything. I just silently mobilized the witchcraft true essence in my body. Fortunately, I had replenished my Taoist qi before I came out. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to deal with him in my previous state. I didn't say anything, but Zhao Hao laughed again. The haze on his face disappeared, replaced by a playful expression. He coughed lightly and said, "I originally didn't want to kill you. I just wanted to punish you and cripple your cultivation. After all, the heavenly grand ritual is about to begin. It's not worth it to kill for no reason. Who knew that I would come to the right place? The sword energy on your body is so dense, so you must have a famous sword with you. Killing you and obtaining a good sword is something to be happy about." A famous sword with me? I instantly broke out in a cold sweat. My first thought was about the Xianyuan sword in Xiang Lu's leather pouch. When it came to famous swords, no one in this world could beat him. However, I quickly realized that the Xianyuan sword was in Xiang Lu's leather pouch and hidden in the sword case. It was unlikely that Zhao Hao could sense it. He was most likely talking about the armor remover sword in my hand. I didn't say anything and started to infuse Taoist qi into the armor remover sword. With the power of the armor remover sword, I didn't dare to say that I could stop the 3 of them, but I could at least buy them some time. I thought that I was doing it secretly, but just as I infused Taoist qi into it, Zhao Hao raised his eyebrows and looked at the armor remover sword in my hand. He asked with interest, "Oh? Is it this sword?" Sword cultivators like him were very sensitive to the aura of swords. That was why he could tell at a glance. I still didn't say anything and focused on the sword. I started to try to control the sword energy that was emitted from the armor remover sword. Zhao Hao seemed to be interested. He stopped his two sword slaves and chuckled. You use a sword too? No wonder you wanted my sword embryo. Oh well, since you use a sword, I'll give you a chance. Let me see what's so special about this sword of yours. After saying that, he stood there calmly and pretended to be appraising it. It was obvious that he didn't care about me at all. I remained silent. After infusing my Taoist Qi, I focused on controlling the sword energy in the armor remover sword. Under the pressure, my control improved a little. This time, it only took me 4 seconds to completely control the sword energy. It gathered in midair and formed a huge sword shadow. The sword shadow was very similar to the armor remover sword. The only difference was that the blade of the armor remover sword was broken. The sword shadow was a complete long sword. It floated in midair and emitted a shocking aura. In terms of power, it had already surpassed the complete Heavenly Master realm. At that moment, Zhao Hao's expression changed. He pointed at the words at the end of the sword shadow and shouted, "Armor remover! You're holding an armor remover sword. How is that possible?" He was from the blessed paradise, so it wasn't strange for him to recognize the armor remover sword. I didn't care and controlled the sword shadow. With a determined aura, it flew towards Zhao Hao like lightning. I didn't know if it was due to the armor remover sword's reputation or the fear of the sword shadow's power, but Zhao Hao didn't dare to resist it. He dodged and shouted in the air, "Sword 3 and Sword 4, help me block it! Help me block it, quick!" Following his voice, the two expressionless sword slaves flashed and appeared in front of Zhao Hao. The sword sheaths in their hands were long gone. At that moment, they each held a long sword in their hands. The two swords had a faint green light flowing on them. The swords were like spring water and the blades were like autumn frost. They intertwined and swung towards the armor remover sword's sword shadow. Song Feng had said that he could fight against Zhao Hao with the armor dismantling sword, but against two Yang God Celestial Master Sword slaves, the armor dismantling sword seemed to be unable to withstand a single blow. After the sword Qi intersected, the sword shadow of the armor dismantling sword completely collapsed between heaven and earth and disappeared without a trace. I originally thought that the sword slaves were inanimate objects. Even if they had Yang God Celestial Master cultivation, it would be good if they could display the full power of the seal. Who knew that the sword slave's power wasn't inferior to that of a Yang God Celestial Master? Seeing the armor remover sword's sword shadow shatter, Zhao Hao smiled with lingering fear. His eyes were filled with greed as he stared at the broken sword in my hand. He said with a trembling voice, "It's actually the armor remover sword." Back then, in Sword Immortal Huang Fu's hands, the armor remover sword's power suppressed an entire generation of the blessed paradise. I don't know how you got it, but in your hands it's a waste. Since that's the case, I'll help Sword Immortal Huang Fu get his sword back. Sword 3 and Sword 4, kill, take the sword. Following his order, the two expressionless sword slaves quickly raised the swords in their hands and attacked me. Chapter 579. Little Ah Mo's Parents? I raised my head and stared at the two sword slaves that were charging at me. They were a man and a woman. The man was skinny and his cheekbones were prominent. His tattered robes looked as though they were hanging on a hanger as they fluttered in the wind. The woman looked much more voluptuous. She was round like a pearl and had a good appearance. However, regardless of whether they were skinny or beautiful, the two of them had inhuman ferocity on their faces. Under Zhao Hao's control, they were like two killing machines. The two long swords in their hands each turned into a ball of sword light that swept towards me. In a hurry, I took out a golden light talisman from my body and threw it forward after activating my Dao Qi. This golden light talisman was something that I had remade after becoming a celestial master. Its power was much greater than before. After the golden light talisman was thrown out, It expanded in the wind and turned into a 10-meter-long wall that shone with golden light. It stood in front of me. The talisman alone wasn't enough to fight against the two-sword slaves. At that moment I softly muttered, "Solidify." It was a word technique that could only be used in the Celestial Master realm. With this technique, the power of the golden light spell was much greater than before. Although it still couldn't fight against the two young god Celestial Masters, it was enough to delay them for a few seconds. After the two Dao techniques were used in an instant, the sword rays in the hands of the two sword slaves had already collided. The divine golden light spell had already turned bronze. After the two sword rays collided, there were several ear-piercing scratching sounds. The bronze wall trembled a few times and its light dimmed a lot. However, it did not dissipate in the end. Seeing that the golden light spell was able to temporarily stop the sword slaves, I instantly became spirited. I started to channel the Dao Qi in my hand into the armor-stripping sword and activated it again. Seeing that their attacks had been obstructed, the two sword slaves attacked again without Zhao Hao's urging. This time, they crossed their swords and swung them out. The two sword lights formed a huge cross in the air. Although it looked much smaller than the two balls of sword lights from before, this huge cross of sword light contained a much more terrifying sword aura than before. In an instant, it collided with the wall created by the golden light talisman. With a crisp sound, a cross-shaped crack appeared on the wall from the point of impact. Then, the crack grew wider and wider, and in the next second, the entire wall collapsed and dissipated. I didn't expect a mere golden light talisman to be able to stop the two of them. My goal was only to stall for time and buy some time for myself. Unfortunately, I needed 4 seconds to activate the armor-dispelling sword, while the sword servant only needed 2 seconds to destroy the golden light talisman. The two sword slaves charged at me again. Fortunately, I had prepared a lot of talismans last time, so I couldn't use the one-word technique in a hurry. I threw out 2 golden talismans, which bought me another 2 seconds. After the sword servant destroyed the 2 talismans, the armor-stripping sword in my hand once again gathered together. However, this time, I didn't condense it into a sword shadow. Instead, I transformed it into a huge axe. I took the initiative to attack, chopping down towards the 2 sword servants. The armor-stripping sword's power wasn't ordinary. It seemed to have the power of a young god celestial master. Even the 2 sword servants didn't dare to underestimate it. They immediately stopped attacking me. Their figures intertwined, but the long swords in their hands didn't block. Instead, they used the tips of their swords to point at the side of the axe. Even though the sword servants had lost their intelligence, their battle instincts were still there. These 2 sword servants, due to their relationship when they were alive, were experts in joint attack. This could be seen from their previous actions. After the tips of the 2 long swords touched the side of the axe, the huge axe that was formed from the armor-stripping sword trembled slightly due to the uneven force, and its direction deviated slightly. Immediately after, the 2 sword servants turned around and moved to the side. The long swords in their hands joined together, and the tips of their swords pointed at the same spot on the huge axe. Sword Qi instantly exploded, causing the huge axe to instantly collapse. It transformed into countless sword rays that scattered in all directions. Even though most of the sword rays shot towards the 2 sword servants, the weak sword rays didn't pose any threat to them. They only needed to block them slightly. I didn't expect the armor-stripping sword to block the 2 of them in one attack, so I took the opportunity to take out the golden light talisman. I didn't have the time to set it up because I was in a hurry. This time, I had more than enough time. When I took out the golden light talisman, I also took out the pure yang talisman. I threw the 2 talismans at the same time, and they turned into a wall burning with extreme yang flames, blocking in front of me. At the same time, I used the one-word technique, which was enough to hold the 2 sword servants back. After doing all that, I activated the armor-stripping sword again. Even though the two sword servants could block the armor-stripping sword, they needed time. As long as I continuously activated the armor-stripping sword, before they could destroy the previous sword ray, the next sword ray would be released. With that, I would have a chance to defeat the two of them. At that moment, I understood that the swords in the two sword servants' hands did indeed have the power of a young god celestial master, but they couldn't use their sun spirits. Their true battle power was still slightly lower than a young god celestial master's. Otherwise, I wouldn't be able to deal with the sun spirits in their bodies. It was rumored that after a young god celestial master's sun spirit left his body, his speed would be extremely fast. Those below the sun spirit level wouldn't be able to stop him. This was the young god celestial master's true killing move. I had fought against Yen Nanshan's sun spirit before, but at that time, his sun spirit didn't have the protection of a physical body. It had been corroded for many years, and his power had fallen to the extreme. He didn't have the power to activate his sun spirit. Otherwise, even the current me wouldn't have been able to escape, let alone me at that time. In the end, the two sword slaves had completely destroyed the armor-removing sword ray that had transformed into a gigantic axe. They raised their longswords once again and attacked the defensive wall that had been strengthened by the golden light talismans, pure yang talismans, and one-word technique. This time, the defensive wall had lasted for 4 seconds and still hadn't dissipated. Under my control, the armor-removing sword ray had transformed into a gigantic sword that had already attacked them. I didn't even look at the outcome, and immediately activated the armor-stripping sword again. Under the threat of life and death, my speed was even faster this time. In just 3 seconds, the next sword shadow appeared and attacked again. At that moment, the previous sword shadow had yet to dissipate, and the two sword shadows attacked at the same time. The two sword servants immediately became flustered, especially the voluptuous girl. Her sword couldn't block in time, and was swept by the sword light. In an instant, a deep sword wound appeared on her shoulder, but strangely, there wasn't any blood flowing out of it. My gaze flashed. Previously, when I heard from old Taoist Huang Zhu that Amo's parents were made into sword servants, I suspected that the Xuanda Paradise's sword servants were related to the corpse-rearing and corpse-controlling technique. Looking at the signs now, my guess should be correct. At that moment, the Tao Qi in my body had already been consumed by more than half, but I still didn't dare to stop. With just 2 sword lights, I had indeed created danger for the 2 sword servants, but it was still impossible to defeat the 2 of them. I had to seize the time and activate the sword lights again. Only by using enough sword lights to nibble away at them bit by bit, before they had enough time to destroy the armor-stripping sword lights, would I be able to find a chance of victory. Thus, I took a deep breath, and once again activated the Tao Qi in my body, and infused it into the armor-stripping sword. The armor-stripping sword let out a soft sound, and countless sword lights soared into the sky. Under my control, they gradually converged into a sword shadow. With a flash, it dashed forward and joined the battle again. I silently estimated the Tao Qi in my body, and guessed that I should be able to activate the armor-stripping sword one more time. Thus, I didn't look at the results of the battle, and prepared to activate it again. However, at that moment I suddenly felt alarmed. In my spiritual sense, I felt a sharp aura rushing towards me from behind. In a hurry, I turned my head. It was Zhao Hao. I didn't know when, but he had circled behind me. He avoided the talismans in front of me, and took advantage of the fact that my attention was completely focused on the 2 sword servants to launch a sneak attack on me. Despicable! Immediately, my eyes widened in anger. This Zhao Hao, who was at the peak of the Heavenly Master realm and even half a step into the Yang God realm, not only had used 2 Yang God sword servants to deal with me, but he had also concealed himself to launch a sneak attack. Even though I was furious, I didn't have enough Tao Qi in my body. In a hurry, I couldn't activate the armor-stripping sword, and Zhao Hao's speed was extremely fast. There was no way for me to dodge. What should I do? In an instant, my mind spun like lightning. Countless thoughts appeared in my mind, but they were all eliminated by me. I couldn't even use the various talismans I had on me. Zhao Hao's speed was too fast. His sword was accurate and ruthless. In the next instant, he would reach my side. I didn't even have time to take out my talismans to activate them. He must have hidden in the dark and prepared for a long time. That was why he found such a suitable opportunity to attack me. This sword was a fatal blow. In the moment of life and death, time seemed to slow down. I watched as Zhao Hao got closer and closer to me. The long sword in his hand seemed to be suffused with a demonic bloody light, as if it was eager to drink human blood. A cruel smile appeared on Zhao Hao's face. It was as if he could already see the scene of my sword piercing through him. Just when he was only a few meters away from me, I suddenly thought of something. I didn't have time to think anymore. I directly reached into Xiang Lu's leather pouch and took out the Xianyuan sword. More accurately, it was the Xianyuan sword box. After I took it out, I didn't have time to activate it. I directly held the Xianyuan sword box in front of me in an attempt to block Zhao Hao's sword. Although the Xianyuan sword was powerful, and Zhao Hao was definitely not its opponent, the Xianyuan sword was in the box. What was blocking Zhao Hao now was the Xianyuan sword box. Moreover, the Xianyuan sword box was only made of wood. To be honest, I wasn't sure if it could block Zhao Hao's sword. At this moment, I didn't have time to speculate. Zhao Hao's speed was extremely fast. At the same time that I held the Xianyuan sword box in front of me, Zhao Hao's sword had already pierced forward. I only saw a flash of light in front of me, as if countless sword lights had exploded in front of me. The light was extremely bright. Even though it was still daytime, my eyes couldn't see anything because of the light. I could only vaguely hear a scream and the sound of something shattering. Countless surging powers converged at this moment. But strangely, I didn't feel any power in my hand that was holding the Xianyuan sword box. Chapter 580. A few seconds later, I tried to open my eyes and looked around blankly. There was still a bright yellow light flashing around me. This light wasn't from Zhao Hao's sword light, but from the Xianyuan sword box in my hand. When I looked at the sword box, I realized that the Xianyuan sword box in my hand was actually undamaged. The only difference was that the partition at the top of the box had been pushed open by an inch. Previously, when I had infused Dao Qi into the Xianyuan sword, there would be a small crack on the box, from which starlight would shoot out. But just now, the Dao Qi in my body had almost withered, and I didn't even have the time to infuse Dao Qi, so how did the Xianyuan sword box open by itself? And from what I remembered, when the sword light shot out, the crack on the box was less than an inch, but this time, the crack was more than an inch. I even noticed that the bright yellow light from before seemed to have appeared from within the sword sheath. My gaze shifted to Zhao Hao, who was not far away. He was currently sitting on the ground with only the hilt of his sword left in his hand. His eyes were wide open as he stared at the Xianyuan sword case, as if he had seen a ghost. He panted heavily and pointed his left index finger at me while muttering, "This." I searched around him for a while and saw countless broken swords. Only then did I confirm that the cracking sound was from the Dao sword in his hand. I didn't activate the Xianyuan sword, so how could it have such power? Even Zhao Hao's Dao sword was broken into pieces. I blankly turned my head and looked at the two sword slaves. Originally, they were still fighting against the armor-stripping sword, but now, the armor-stripping sword's sword shadows had disappeared to who knows where. As for the two sword slaves, there were countless sword scars on their bodies. They were prostrating on the ground, as though they were worshipping me. The two swords in their hands were also trembling slightly, with the tips of the swords pointing towards me, as though they were kowtowing to me. After stuttering for a long time, Zhao Hao seemed to have recovered his ability to speak. He jumped up from the ground and shouted at me, What sword is this? This isn't the armor-stripping sword. This sword energy. This sword energy. It directly shattered my Dao sword, and even the sword slaves had to kneel down. Even the purple lightning and clear frost in their hands were trembling. This was the legendary king's sword. Once the king's sword appears, all the other swords prostrate themselves in worship. He was like a madman, his words scattered, his eyes filled with shock and greed. After he finished speaking, he kept repeating the two words, Wang Jian. I didn't know what the king's sword he was talking about was, but I obviously couldn't tell him the true identity of the Xianyuan sword. I turned my wrist and put the Xianyuan sword case back into the Shangliu leather pouch. Seeing my actions, Zhao Hao suddenly went crazy. He only held a sword hilt in his hand and swung it at me crazily while shouting, Hand it over! Hand over the king's sword! Ha 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 ha! My Xuanda Grotto heaven has been searching for this sword for generations. If I can get my hands on this king's sword, I, Zhao Hao, will definitely be able to ascend to the heavens and become an immortal. I, Zhao Hao, will become a sword immortal. The expression on his face was ferocious, as if he wanted to devour someone. However, there was only a sword hilt left in his hand. No matter how high his cultivation was, he wasn't a threat to me. After going crazy for a long time, he seemed to have finally recovered a little. He lowered his head to look at the sword hilt in his hand, and forcefully threw it to the side. Then, he looked at the two sword slaves who were still prostrating on the ground behind me. He gritted his teeth and said, Sword 3, Sword 4, kill this person. It seemed that after I put the Xianyuan sword case away, the two sword slaves didn't have the respect they had before. Hearing Zhao Hao's order, they immediately stood up, picked up two long swords, and attacked me again. Zhao Hao stood where he was and closed his eyes. He seemed to have realized that he had lost his mind and was trying hard to recover. I hesitated whether or not I should take out the Xianyuan sword again. With the Taoist qi in my body, it was impossible to activate the armor-removing sword. However, from Zhao Hao's crazed expression, he seemed to be drooling over the Xianyuan sword, as if he wanted it at all costs. Instinctively, I wanted to hide the Xianyuan sword and not let Zhao Hao see it again. As I was thinking, an old voice suddenly sounded beside me. Mr. Zhao, please stop. Hearing this voice, I quickly turned to look. I didn't know when an old figure had appeared not far from me. I instantly felt relieved and said with a wry smile, Uncle Fu, you made me wait for a long time. The person who had come was Wang Can's Yang God Celestial Master Realm Slave, Ah Fu. Just now, the Xianyuan sword's strange performance had blocked Zhao Hao and temporarily resolved my crisis. However, I didn't know what had happened, and I wasn't sure whether the Xianyuan sword could block it again. At this time, both Zhao Hao and the sword slaves still had their battle power. Without Ah Fu's appearance, I still couldn't block it by myself. Just as I had guessed, although there was no talisman or sound transmission, Wang Can had been paying attention to me. After discovering that I had disappeared, he would immediately send people to search for me. From the time Zhao Hao had surrounded me until now, although we had fought several times, only less than half an hour had passed. When Ah Fu appeared, Zhao Hao instantly opened his eyes, and his expression became extremely unsightly. With a gloomy expression, he said in a cold voice, I set up the 9 exquisite tunes formation here, but you actually discovered it so quickly. My Wangu Grotto Heaven has a way. Mr. Zhao, please go back. Ah Fu was still unhurried. His waist was slightly bent, and his face didn't change as he said slowly. Zhao Hao stared at Ah Fu for a few seconds, then he turned his head and stared at me. After a long time of silence, he squeezed out a few words from between his teeth. Wanwu Grotto Heaven. Today's matter is over for the time being. We'll deal with it later. After saying that, he gave me a gloomy smile. Then, he suddenly waved his hand and left with the sword slaves. After their figures disappeared, Ah Fu turned his head and bowed to me to apologize. This old slave came late. I hope the holy saint can forgive me. I shook my head and said with a wry smile, Uncle Fu, don't say that. If you hadn't come here in time, I would have been in trouble today. All right, thank you, Uncle Fu. I've consumed too much energy in the battle. Let's go back. I didn't mention what had happened just now. It was indeed Wang Can's fault that such a thing had happened in Wanwu Grotto Heaven's territory. Unfortunately, Wanwu Grotto Heaven's power was too weak to deter the other Grotto Heavens, especially Xuanda Grotto Heaven. They didn't put Wanwu Grotto Heaven in their eyes, so Wang Can couldn't do anything about it. After saying that, I was about to leave. Ah Fu stood still and said to me, If the holy saint is okay, please come with this old slave. The young master has something to do, so he asked me to take the holy saint there. Wang Can wanted to see me? I had consumed too much Taoist energy, but I still had witchcraft energy in my body. It wasn't a big problem. Moreover, Ah Fu was here, so I was safe. I thought for a while and nodded, asking Ah Fu to lead the way. Ah Fu was a taciturn person. He didn't say anything to me, and I didn't ask. We walked through the forest and soon reached a cliff. Ah Fu turned his head and said to me respectfully, The young master is outside the Grotto Heaven. Holy Saint, please get ready. This old slave is going to cast a spell to take the Holy Saint out. I nodded. Ah Fu raised both of his hands. Instantly, a 7-colored light surged. Then, I felt the world spin around me. When the 7-colored light in front of my eyes disappeared, I found myself standing on the ground. After leaving Wanwu Grotto Heaven, I followed Ah Fu and walked through the forest for another 15 minutes. Then, we arrived at the Taoist temple where I had met Imo Wang Can came to greet us. When he saw me, he knelt on the ground in shame. He said in a deep voice, Ah Fu told me that the holy saint was in danger. It was my fault. Please punish me. His face was filled with shame and annoyance, but more than that, he felt humiliated. I understood his situation. I sighed and pulled him up from the ground. I shook my head and said in a deep voice, You don't have to do this. Let Zhao Hao be arrogant for a while. At the heavenly grand ritual, as long as we keep Wanwu Grotto Heaven's ranking, we will find Zhao Hao to settle the score. You don't have to take it to heart. Wang Can stood up from the ground. His face looked better, but he still said bitterly, If my father hadn't passed away, how could the Xuanda Grotto Heaven's Grotto Heaven be so proud? It's my fault. Our Wang family has always had only one descendant. I used to have my father's protection, so I didn't take cultivation seriously. Now, it's too late to regret it. I comforted him with a smile. What's there to regret? At your age, your cultivation is already extraordinary. What's more, cultivation can't be rushed. You have to be down to earth and take each step carefully. Wang Can nodded, but there was a hint of pride on his face. My Wang family only needs to stay dormant for a few more years. After I condense my yang spirit, the other Grotto Heavens and Blessed Lands will still follow the lead of Wanwu Grotto Heaven. I had discussed this issue with Wang Can. As one of the 9 cauldrons families, Wanwu Grotto Heaven had always cultivated witch qi. When condensing their yang spirit, they needed to condense their 3 souls and combine them with the Tai Sui. Naturally, their power would be far greater than that of Taoist qi cultivators. So, Wang Can was right. After he condensed his yang spirit, Wanwu Grotto Heaven would stand up again, and the other Grotto Heavens and Blessed Lands could no longer be underestimated. But the problem was, the world was so big. Where could they find the Tai Sui? The Wang family had always cultivated witch qi, and the servants also cultivated Taoist qi. The fundamental reason was that the Tai Sui was rare. I had talked to Wang Can about this issue, but he didn't seem to care. He only said that his father had told him that when he condensed his yang spirit, he would have a chance. I didn't know about Wang Can's chance, but I knew the rarity of the Tai Sui. But now that Wang Can had regained his confidence, I didn't want to discourage him. I just smiled and asked him why he had called me here. Wang Can's face quickly calmed down. He sighed, pointed at the shabby temple, and whispered, Huang Zhu couldn't hold on anymore. He begged me to see you. I thought the sage would also want to see him, so I used a secret technique to temporarily keep him alive and asked the sage to come here. You're tuning in to the Phoenix Knights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.